Have you ever wondered what happened when humans did something almost unnatural for most of our existence, and chose not to leave for hundreds of thousands of years? Survival meant moving on, following water, following herds, following the seasons. But somewhere in the deep past, at the edge of a river or beneath a familiar hillside, a few people made a quieter, stranger choice. They stayed, and that small decision may have changed everything that came after. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel if this is the kind of mystery history you enjoy. The wind moves first, long before the people do, dragging thin curtains of dust across a valley that has known their footsteps for generations. It slips through dry grass, over stone tools left where they were last used, across the faint impressions of fires that once burned but now leave only pale scars in the earth. This is a place designed for departure. The seasons shift, the animals move, the water retreats, and with it, always, the people follow. That is how it has always been. That is how it is supposed to be. But something has changed. At the edge of a shallow river, where water still pools in the bend of a channel carved long ago, a group remains, not for a day, not for a passing season, but longer. Long enough that the ground begins to remember them. Long enough that the ash accumulates in layers. Long enough that the paths between their shelters deepen into something more permanent than habit. There are signs, subtle at first, that this is no longer just another stop along an endless route. A spear is repaired instead of replaced. A broken tool is not discarded, but set aside for later shaping. Food is not only gathered and consumed, but stored carefully, deliberately, in places that suggest a return, not a departure. These are small acts, almost invisible in isolation, but together they form a quiet defiance of something ancient and deeply embedded. Movement is no longer the unquestioned answer. Before we go deeper, take a moment to like the video and subscribe if this is the kind of history and mystery you enjoy. For hundreds of thousands of years, human life is defined by motion, not constant wandering without purpose, but a patterned, intelligent movement across landscapes that shift and recover, bloom and empty, freeze and thaw. Groups follow migrations of animals, cycles of plants, the rise and fall of rivers. Knowledge is carried not in maps, but in memory routes learned through repetition, passed down through observation and survival. To stay too long in one place is to risk hunger, scarcity, and eventually death. And yet, here, something resists that logic. The river is not particularly large. It swells in certain seasons, then shrinks back, exposing banks rich with reeds and small fish. Nearby, there are stands of wild grasses, their seeds abundant enough to be collected in quantities that matter. Herds pass through, not always predictably, but often enough to be relied upon with some confidence. It is not a perfect place. No place is, but it is, perhaps, good enough. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that such places begin to exert a kind of pull, not a force that traps, but one that persuades. The effort required to leave starts to outweigh the risks of staying. Familiarity becomes an asset. The people know where the water lingers longest. They know where certain plants return year after year. They learn the rhythms of this specific land, not just the broader movements across regions. This knowledge changes the calculation. Instead of scanning the horizon for signs of movement, attention turns inward, toward the ground beneath their feet. Instead of preparing to leave, they begin, cautiously, to prepare to remain. It is not a single decision made at a single moment. There is no clear boundary where migration ends and settlement begins. Scholars still debate how conscious this shift would have felt to those living through it. It may not have been understood as a refusal at all, but simply as a delay that slowly extended into something else. The signs accumulate. Shelters, once light and temporary, begin to show signs of reinforcement. Posts are driven deeper. Walls are patched and rebuilt rather than abandoned. Hearths are reused, their stones blackened again and again. Around them, the debris of daily life gathers in ways that only happen when people do not move on. Bone fragments, discarded tools, the remains of meals all begin to layer over time, creating a record of continuity. There are also the more intimate traces, places where individuals are buried close to where they lived, not left behind as the group moves on, but kept within the same space, beneath floors or just beyond the edges of habitation. This suggests a different relationship not just to land, but to memory. The dead remain where the living remain. The place itself begins to hold identity. The wind still moves, and sometimes it carries the scent of distant rain or the distant movement of animals. Instinct, shaped over countless generations, must still whisper that it is time to go. But leaving becomes harder, not physically, but psychologically. There is more to abandon now, more than tools and shelters. There is familiarity, and perhaps even a sense, however faint, of belonging. It is tempting to imagine this as a calm transition, but the evidence does not support that simplicity. The decision, if it can be called that, likely carries tension. Some individuals may still favour movement, urging the group to follow old patterns. Others may argue, through action rather than words, that staying offers advantages that cannot be ignored. No single explanation fully accounts for how these tensions are resolved. But what emerges is a pattern seen in multiple regions at different times. A slowing, a hesitation, then gradually a commitment. The landscape itself begins to change in response. Paths become more defined. Areas are cleared, intentionally or not, through repeated use. The presence of humans starts to shape the environment in ways that accumulate. Fires may be set deliberately to manage vegetation. Certain plants may be encouraged, whether consciously or simply through repeated harvesting and scattering. The boundary between natural and human-shaped space begins to blur. In this early stage, there are no cities, no walls of stone rising above the horizon, no monuments declaring permanence, but the seeds of all those things are here, embedded in this quieter, more subtle transformation. The refusal to migrate is not dramatic. It does not announce itself. It emerges through repetition, through the accumulation of small choices that, over time, become irreversible. There is also a deeper shift, one that leaves fewer traces but may be even more significant. Time itself begins to feel different. When people move constantly, the past is something left behind in places that are no longer visited, but when they remain, the past accumulates in a single location. The ground becomes layered with memory. Each return to the same spot carries echoes of previous days, previous seasons, previous lives. What survives in the record suggests that this creates a new relationship with both past and future. The idea of return becomes central, not just returning to a place after a short absence, but returning again and again, across years, across generations. This continuity allows for planning in ways that are difficult in a fully mobile life. Food can be stored for future use. Structures can be improved over time. Knowledge becomes tied to specific locations. And yet, uncertainty remains. The evidence is fragmentary, scattered across sites and regions, each offering only a partial glimpse into a much larger story. Scholars still debate whether this shift is driven primarily by environmental opportunity, by social change, by early forms of cultivation, or by a combination of all these factors. What is clear is that it does not happen everywhere at once, nor does it follow a single path. In some places, groups continue to move for thousands of years after others have begun to settle. In others, people may settle temporarily, then return to mobility when conditions change. The boundary is not fixed, it is fluid, contested, and often reversible. But here, in this valley, at this river bend, something holds. The people wake in the same place they slept the night before. They tend to the same hearth. They walk the same short paths between water, shelter, and food. Days begin to resemble one another in ways that are new. There is comfort in this repetition, but also a quiet risk. The land must continue to provide. The water must remain. The balance must hold. For now, it does. The wind passes again, lifting dust from the ground, but the people do not follow it. They remain, watching as the horizon shifts without them, as the world continues its endless motion while they, for the first time, begin to stand still. For almost all of human existence, stillness is the exception, and movement is the rule. Long before walls, before fields, before roads that promise a fixed destination, human beings survive because they do not remain where the world is failing. They leave when the herd thins, when the berries are stripped, when the river contracts into a chain of muddy pools, when cold lowers itself over the land like a sentence. The genius of early humanity is not in building permanence, but in reading impermanence correctly. To move at the right time is not restlessness, it is intelligence. That older world is not chaotic, it has its own order, and it is a demanding one. Families and bands cross familiar ground in cycles that may look aimless from a distance, but are in fact finely tuned to season, migration, and risk. Certain valleys are visited in one part of the year, certain coasts in another. High ground becomes useful when lower ground floods. Open steppe matters when the great animals pass through. Forest edges offer a different set of advantages than marshland or riverbank. The land is not owned, enclosed, or divided into permanent claims. It is known through use, memory, and timing. To live this way requires a specific kind of mind. One must remember not just one place, but many. One must carry a map in the body, not on paper where water collects after late rains, where flint can be found, where fish run in their season, where dangerous groups may also be moving. Children learn not by staying in the one homeland, but by travelling through a network of landscapes, each with its own rules. Old people are valuable not because they guard property, but because they hold roots. Cycles and warnings in memory. Knowledge is mobile because life is mobile. This does not mean human beings are forever drifting across empty distance. That image, common and misleading, flattens a much more sophisticated reality. Many prehistoric groups are not nomadic in the loose sense of endless wandering. They are often seasonally mobile, shifting between known locations, returning to favoured grounds, revisiting camps that may have been used by parents and grandparents. Some create substantial temporary structures, some store resources, some revisit the same fishing spots, hunting zones, and gathering grounds for generations. Even in highly mobile societies there is attachment, but attachment is not yet the same thing as staying. The distinction matters. A mobile people can love a place and still leave it. In fact, leaving may be the reason they survive long enough to return. The old pattern depends on restraint. It prevents overuse of local resources. It allows landscapes time to recover. It spreads risk across different environments. It protects against the disaster of depending too heavily on a single patch of ground. Mobility is expensive in labour, but it is often safer than commitment. A group that can move retains options. A group that cannot is at the mercy of local failure. Across the Pleistocene world, this way of life helps human beings expand into astonishingly different environments. They move through African savannas, along Eurasian grasslands, into temperate forests, across coastlines, into Australia, eventually into the far north and into the Americas. No single habitat defines them. Flexibility does. The capacity to move, adapt, improvise, and read unfamiliar land becomes one of the great human advantages. It is one reason our species spread so widely while many other human relatives disappear. Movement is not merely behaviour, it is part of the human inheritance. And yet this inheritance carries its own limits. Mobility is powerful, but it also sets boundaries on what can be accumulated, built, and remembered in one place. Objects must be portable or expendable. Shelter must often be temporary. The dead may be mourned, but not always kept close. Material life is governed by weight, transport, and timing. There is little sense in constructing something that cannot be carried unless one expects to return soon. There is little reason to store large quantities of food unless one can defend or revisit it. In a mobile world, investment in place remains cautious. What survives in the archaeological record captures this caution in fragments. Stone tools appear in scatters rather than dense layers. Hearths are present, but often isolated. Animal bones suggest repeated hunting episodes rather than permanent residence. Sites flare into use, then fall silent, then are revisited. In some regions, caves serve as recurring shelters. In others, open-air camps appear briefly and vanish beneath sediment. The pattern is one of pulses, not permanence. This is why the later shift matters so much. To stop moving is not simply to choose comfort over travel. It is to reverse a strategy that has worked for an immense span of time. It is to become less flexible in one sense, while hoping to become more secure in another. From the perspective of deep human history, this is a dangerous experiment. It also requires a different emotional relationship to uncertainty. A mobile group responds to scarcity by leaving. A settling group must endure longer, plan further ahead, and trust more heavily in the possibility that a familiar place will continue to provide. That trust may be earned through experience, but it is still a gamble. The evidence remains incomplete, yet what survives in the record suggests that the first communities edging toward permanence do not abandon mobility all at once. They negotiate with it, they reduce its range, they shorten its cycles. They remain longer, leave less often, and begin to build routines around return that slowly harden into residence. There is a revealing irony here. The earlier steps towards staying still are often made by people who are already very good at moving. They are not clumsy wanderers suddenly discovering settlement as an obvious improvement. They are experts in mobility, with all the ecological knowledge and practical discipline that such expertise demands. That makes their hesitation more interesting. They are not ignorant of the risks of remaining. They know them well. Which means that when some groups begin to stay longer in one place, the local advantages must have become unusually compelling. In several parts of the world, especially toward the end of the last ice age, conditions begin to shift in ways that make this old balance less stable and more intriguing. Climate oscillates. Some environments grow richer in concentrated resources, in particular places, wild cereals, fish, shellfish, gazelle, waterfowl, nuts, or tubers become available in combinations dense enough to support longer occupation. Repeated seasonal return starts to resemble semi-permanence. People are still mobile, but now the movement can seem almost reluctant, as if they are circling a centre rather than ranging freely across a broad world. Scholars still debate exactly how universal this process is, and no single explanation fully accounts for it. Some groups become more settled before full agriculture. Some cultivate while still moving substantially. Some remain mobile long after neighbouring populations begin to establish villages. The shift is patchy, regionally specific, and shaped by local opportunity. But the broad pattern remains striking. Human life, once built around motion, begins in certain places to gather around fixed points. That change must have felt subtle at first. No trumpet sounds, no clear generation wakes up and announces that a wandering age has ended. Instead, a family stays through an extra season. A camp is repaired rather than rebuilt elsewhere. A store of food makes departure less urgent. An elder is buried nearby. A child grows up knowing not only the route between places, but the feeling of one place as central. That is how large transformations usually begin, not with spectacle, but with repetition. There are clues that even in these early phases, mobility and rootedness pull against each other. People continue to hunt at distance, to gather beyond the settlement, to exchange stone or shells over long ranges. Fixed residence does not erase wider connection. In some cases, it may intensify it. A place worth staying in becomes a hub, drawing in visitors, trade, mates, information, and perhaps conflict. The refusal to migrate fully does not end movement around that place. It reorganizes it. This may be one of the strangest parts of the story. Settlement is often imagined as the opposite of motion, but in reality it produces new kinds of movement. Resources must be brought in. Defended boundaries must be patrolled. Seasonal tasks still continue beyond the core settlement. Children may inherit a home base, but their world does not become smaller so much as differently structured. The centre holds, and everything else begins to orbit it. What makes the older mobile world so important is that it reveals how radical this new centre really is. For tens of thousands of years, perhaps longer depending on how broadly one looks across earlier humans, there is no need for a permanent anchor. Human communities survive by refusing to become trapped. They know, in a practical and unsentimental way, that landscapes fail, rivers shift, herds change their route. Local abundance can vanish with terrifying speed. Staying too long in one place can be the most dangerous mistake of all, and still is eventually, and some people make it. They do so slowly, unevenly, and with no guarantee that it will work. But once the old inheritance of motion begins to weaken in certain places, the consequences will spread far beyond those first settlements. The entire architecture of later human life property, inheritance, stored wealth, territorial conflict, fixed ritual space. Even the idea of home as a permanent structure depends on this break from the older world. It begins not with conquest or invention, but with restraint. With a group that knows how to leave and does not. The horizon remains where it has always been, open and distant and full of possibility. The old roots are still there. The instincts that once sent people after rain and game have not vanished. But a different instinct is taking form now, quieter and more dangerous in its own way, the instinct to remain and make the land answer to memory instead of movement. What finally makes a human group risk stillness is not comfort. It is rarely comfort. The first places that hold people are not gentle in any modern sense, and they do not offer certainty. They offer something more persuasive and more dangerous: repeated abundance. Not endless abundance, not effortless abundance, but enough concentrated life in one area that leaving begins to feel inefficient, even wasteful. The old logic of movement starts to fray at the edges when a landscape produces too much to ignore, and does so often enough to be remembered. Such places are not common. Most of the world does not invite long residence for hunter-gatherers. Resources are scattered, seasonal, thinly spread across large distances. To remain in one spot under those conditions is to consume the near field too quickly and turn familiarity into vulnerability. But there are exceptions, and the exceptions matter enormously. River valleys, marshlands, lake shores, coasts, ecotones where 2 or 3 environments meet, upland edges above floodplains, spring-fed basins, and grass-rich zones where herd animals reliably pass through. These can produce a kind of gravitational pull. The attraction is cumulative. A place with fresh water is already valuable. A place with fresh water and fish is better. Add migratory birds in season, reeds for weaving, wild cereals close by, gazelle or deer moving through nearby, edible roots, nuts, shellfish, and workable stone within reachable distance, and suddenly the landscape begins to do something unusual. It compresses survival. It brings multiple necessities into one geographic frame. Instead of requiring a wide circuit to gather what is needed, the land begins to provide more densely, more predictably, and with less constant relocation. That density changes everything. A mobile life depends on spread. A settling life becomes possible when spread gives way to concentration. This does not mean abundance in the modern sense of safety or surplus. There are still lean periods, failed hunts, harsh winters, sudden floods, disease, and the quiet violence of bad luck. But what survives in the archaeological record suggests that some locations become reliable enough to encourage longer occupation, simply because the ratio of effort to return improves. A group can gather more in less time. Children and older adults may be moved less often. Structures can remain standing long enough to matter. Time once spent travelling between resource zones can be spent repairing, storing, processing, and watching. The Near East offers some of the clearest early examples of this shift, though it is not unique in principle. Toward the end of the Pleistocene and into the Epipaleolithic, especially in parts of the Levant, some groups begin settling for longer periods in landscapes rich with wild cereals, game, and water. Places associated with the Natufian horizon are especially striking because they suggest substantial occupation before full agriculture has taken hold. People are not yet peasants in the later sense. They are still hunters and gatherers, but in certain environments they are doing something that their ancestors do only lightly or temporarily. They are leaning toward permanence. This matters because it breaks an old assumption. Farming is often imagined as the cause of settlement, but in several cases the evidence points to a more complicated pattern. Sedentism, or near-sedentism, may come first in some regions, supported by concentrated wild resources. Cultivation then intensifies later as people become more dependent on local landscapes and more invested in making them productive. Scholars still debate the sequence and the degree to which one process drives the other, but the evidence remains strong that certain lands begin to hold people before true agriculture fully matures. That holding power is environmental, but it is also psychological. Once a place proves itself across repeated seasons, human memory starts to attach not only to its usefulness, but to its character. The bend in the river where fish gather after rain, the patch of slope where wild barley stands thickest, the stand of trees that marks where shade holds longest in summer, the spring that remains cold when other water turns sluggish and warm. The more intimately a place is known, the more valuable it becomes. Knowledge itself becomes local capital. There is something almost paradoxical in this. Mobility had always depended on wide knowledge, on holding many places in mind at once. But the land that holds people invites a narrower, deeper intimacy. Instead of knowing dozens of places moderately well, one begins to know one place in increasingly fine detail. The small differences matter now. Slight changes in soil, water level, animal timing, exposure to wind, the way winter light falls on a slope. The path reeds take over a marsh margin, these become useful, then meaningful. This helps explain why not every rich landscape produces the same outcome. Abundance alone is not enough. It must be accessible, recurrent, and legible. A place has to teach its rhythms to those who live there, and the people must live long enough in one pattern to learn them. Some coasts may be bountiful but dangerous. Some valleys may flood too violently. Some marshes may provide food but also disease. Some grasslands may attract herd animals but not water. No single explanation fully accounts for why one place becomes a home base while another remains a temporary camp. But what survives in the record suggests that the most successful early anchors combine variety with repeatability. Lakeshores are especially revealing in this respect. They are edges, and edges are biologically productive. Water draws animals, plants gather in specific zones. Fish and waterfowl add layers of seasonal opportunity. Mud preserves footprints, debris, and in some rare cases, astonishing traces of human routine. The same is true for river valleys, where floodplains can create rich corridors of plant and animal life, even if they also bring danger. To stay near such places is to accept risk, but it is also to live at the center of intersecting ecologies. The land becomes less a backdrop than a machine of recurring possibilities. Coastal zones offer another version of the same pattern. In parts of the world where shellfish, fish, seabirds, and shoreline plants are abundant, human groups can remain longer than would be possible inland. Some later coastal settlements become immense accumulations of refuse, especially shell middens, physical evidence that people return to the same places so often that their meals built landscapes of their own. These are not neat villages in the beginning, but they show what happens when a rich ecological edge permits repeated residence. The sea, unlike migrating herds, does not vanish over the horizon in the same way. It remains, and its persistence invites the human imagination to remain with it. There is also a quieter, less obvious factor. Predictability reduces fear. A mobile life is efficient, but it is also full of uncertainty. Each move carries risk. New camps must be chosen, water sources checked, distant movements interpreted. To remain in a known place can ease some of that burden, at least temporarily. Children sleep in familiar surroundings. Tools are kept where they can be found. Routines form. Even if the landscape is harsh, familiarity lowers certain kinds of danger. That may help explain why repeated return slowly becomes something stronger. The land does not just feed the group, it stabilizes it. Yet the same stability can become a trap. A place that is rich enough to encourage staying is also a place that others may want. This is one reason the first settled landscapes may already contain the beginnings of territorial tension. A mobile people can avoid conflict by shifting range. A people tied to a high-value patch has fewer graceful exits. The land that holds them also exposes them. Even before formal property, one can imagine the pressure building around access to springs, stands of wild grain, fishing narrows, or favoured hunting approaches. The first fixed attachments are never purely peaceful. The evidence remains incomplete, but there are hints that dense occupation and resource concentration bring new forms of stress along with their advantages. There is a lesser-known detail in this story that matters. Many of the early places that encourage settlement are not spectacular. They are not the grandest mountains, the most dramatic coasts, or the most fertile regions in an abstract sense. Often they are modest landscapes with just the right combination of water, wild food, shelter, and repeatability. This is important because it reminds us that civilization does not begin in grandeur. It begins in practical sufficiency. A valley does not need to be beautiful to hold people. It only needs to answer enough needs often enough that leaving starts to feel irrational. And once that threshold is crossed, material life begins to thicken. Mortars for grinding grain become more worthwhile when they do not need to be carried. Heavier tools can remain on site. Storage pits can be dug. Shelters can be improved. Refuse can accumulate. Burials can take place near the living. Dogs, in some cases, may become part of the settled rhythm, not only as companions in movement, but as participants in the life of a fixed place. The first home is not a house in the modern emotional sense. It is an ecological bargain that starts generating emotional consequences. Scholars still debate how aware these early communities are of the long-term implications of remaining. The answer is probably not very. No one needs to foresee cities for settlement to begin. No one needs to imagine states, taxation, or walls for a family to choose one valley over another. The process is narrower, more immediate, and far more human. A place proves itself. It becomes easier to return, then harder to leave. Over time, the people who know it best are shaped by it, and it by them. So the land that holds them is not merely rich, it is convincing. It offers the oldest temptation in a new form, not the promise of endless movement towards survival, but the possibility that survival might now gather around one remembered centre. That possibility is fragile, uncertain, and loaded with consequences that nobody yet understands. But it is enough to delay departure, enough to repair rather than pack, enough to sleep again by the same hearth and wake once more to the same patch of sky. A camp can be left without breaking the heart. That is one of its defining features. It exists for use, not devotion. Its fire burns, its shelters hold against wind for a time, its refuse gathers in shallow traces, and then the people go. The land closes over their absence with surprising speed. Grasses return, ash thins into the soil. Footpaths fade, another season comes, and the place becomes once again what it was before human need briefly interrupted it. For most of prehistory, this is how life works. Presence is real, but it is light. Even when people return to the same places over many years, the relationship remains flexible. The camp is important, but it is not yet a centre of gravity. That begins to change when repetition stops being merely practical and becomes cumulative. The first sign is often not the structure itself, but the decision to improve it. A temporary shelter is usually built with departure in mind. It is enough to endure weather, not enough to outlast time. But once a group expects to remain longer, or return soon, small changes make sense. Walls can be strengthened. Roofs can be repaired instead of replaced. Floors can be cleared and levelled. Stone can be used where brush once sufficed. A hearth can be lined and relined. What begins as a camp starts to acquire investment, and investment is one of the clearest archaeological fingerprints of attachment. There is practical logic to this. Labour spent improving a place yields future comfort only if one expects to benefit from it again. A stronger wall is irrational in a landscape of total mobility. A storage pit makes little sense if no one will be there to open it. Heavy grinding stones are burdens if life is still governed by immediate transport. But the moment a place becomes reliable enough to revisit, or stable enough to inhabit for longer stretches, labour changes character. Work done today begins to serve tomorrow. That subtle expansion of time is one of the quiet revolutions of human history. What survives in the record often captures this revolution in ordinary things. Floors worn smooth by repeated use, hearths rebuilt in the same position, post holes marking structures that are maintained or replaced on the same footprint, clusters of tools suggesting fixed activity areas, middens forming where waste consistently accumulates rather than scattering across temporary camps. These are not grand signals, but together they show that daily life has started to fold itself around a particular location. And with repeated life in one place comes a new kind of memory. Memory in a mobile world is route-based. It lives in movement, in timing, in the sequence of places and the knowledge required to pass safely between them. But memory in a settled or semi-settled world begins to acquire depth. Events happen in the same location, one after another, until the ground itself becomes layered with meaning. A child is born near the same hearth where an elder once sat. A tool is repaired in the same doorway where fish were cleaned the previous year. A flood mark remains visible on a wall. The first snowfall of one winter is compared to another winter years earlier. Place begins to hold chronology. This matters because chronology creates attachment more powerfully than utility alone. A good camp can be useful. A remembered place becomes personal. The distinction is immense. One can leave a useful place with regret, but to leave a place saturated with memory is to abandon part of the story by which a group understands itself. Burial deepens this change. Few acts bind the living to place more strongly than keeping the dead nearby. In several early sedentary or semi-sedentary contexts, burials appear beneath floors, within settlement areas, or immediately adjacent to houses and activity zones. The dead are no longer simply mourned and left in the path of continued movement. They remain in the place where life continues. This suggests not only attachment, but continuity. The settlement ceases to be merely a node of survival and becomes a vessel of ancestry. Scholars still debate exactly what these burial practices mean in each region, because the evidence remains incomplete, and symbolic behaviour is notoriously difficult to reconstruct with certainty. But what survives in the record suggests a profound alteration in the emotional geography of human life. A place with one's dead in it is harder to leave. A place where the living sleep above the buried is no longer just a camp. It has become a claim, even if no formal language of property yet exists. Storage adds another layer. In a mobile existence, food is often consumed, dried, or distributed with transport in mind. The future is planned through movement more than accumulation. But when people begin to stay longer, they can save. Seeds can be collected and held. Nuts can be kept. Dried meat, fish, or gathered plant foods can be stored against leaner days. This creates not only security, but dependence. Stored food makes a place more valuable precisely because it contains delayed labour. The work of one season is now physically waiting in the ground or in a sheltered corner for the next. That changes behavior in ways both practical and psychological. Theft becomes meaningful, defense becomes necessary, return becomes urgent, planning stretches further. The future is no longer just the next move, it is something waiting in the same place where one has invested work. This may be one of the hidden mechanisms by which attachment hardens into obligation. Once effort is buried in a place, leaving it becomes a form of loss. There is also the matter of objects. Not all technologies travel equally well. A people who move constantly must be selective. Weight matters. Fragility matters. The burden of transport disciplines accumulation. But the people who begin to stay can keep heavier and more specialized tools, mortars, large stones for grinding, substantial containers, repair materials, weaving equipment, and other items that would be impractical for constant travel become possible, even desirable. Material life thickens around the settlement, and the settlement in turn becomes harder to abandon because it now contains a world of useful things. This does not happen overnight, and it does not happen cleanly. The archaeological record often shows mixed lifeways rather than total transformation. People may stay for longer parts of the year and still leave seasonally. They may maintain a core settlement while sending out hunting parties or gathering expeditions. They may return repeatedly to the same place without living there year-round. No single explanation fully accounts for the pace or form of the change. Attachment grows unevenly, and in many cases, reversibly. Yet the pattern remains visible. Camps begin to acquire weight, not only physical but social. Routine is part of that weight. A life on the move has rhythms, but they are rhythms of transition. A more settled life introduces routines tied to fixed space. Sleeping here, cooking there, storing in this corner, discarding in that one, repairing tools at a particular threshold, gathering at a known hearth. Space becomes organized by repetition. Once a group begins structuring action in relation to place, the place itself starts to structure the group. Paths form between recurring points of use. Areas become associated with certain people, tasks, or times. Architecture, even very simple architecture, begins to teach behavior. Children likely experience this shift differently from adults. An older person who grew up more fully mobile carries wide roots in memory and may still feel the old reflex toward departure when resources thin or weather changes. A child raised around a more anchored settlement learns something else as normal. The same doorway, the same storage pit, the same water source, the same cluster of neighboring shelters, even if movement still remains part of life. Centrality begins to take root in perception. One place is no longer just one place among many. It is the place from which others are understood. What survives in the record suggests that this generational effect may be more important than any single decision. Social transformations often become permanent not when adults choose them, but when children inherit them as ordinary. A community can experiment with longer residence for a decade and still revert to older patterns. But when the material and emotional habits of place begin shaping the next generation from the beginning, the balance shifts. Attachment becomes less of a strategy and more of a default condition. There is a lesser-known strangeness here that matters. Settlement does not only create comfort, it creates visibility. In a mobile world, social tensions can disperse. Distance provides relief. In a fixed settlement, people see more of one another, more consistently, under the same constraints. Habits become legible. Labor can be compared. Difference is harder to hide. This may have consequences for cooperation, but also for conflict, hierarchy, resentment, and expectation. The closeness that makes attachment possible also intensifies the social weather inside a group. That social weather may be one reason camps become emotionally complicated as they turn into homes. A place of attachment is not always peaceful. It can be a source of pride and identity, but also of pressure. The same walls that shelter also contain. The same routines that stabilize also constrain. Scholars still debate how early such tensions emerge, yet it is difficult to imagine permanence growing without them. To stay together in one place is to become more entangled in one another's labour, memory and need, and so the old camp begins to change its character. It is no longer just where people happen to be. It becomes where things are kept, where ancestors lie, where effort accumulates, where children grow with recurring sights and sounds, where yesterday remains physically present in ash, bone, post holes, worn thresholds, and buried stores. The landscape around it becomes more familiar, but the settlement itself becomes something more than practical shelter. It becomes an emotional machine, quietly producing loyalty. The move from camp to attachment may be the most human step in the entire story, because it is so incremental and so easy to miss. No walls need rise above the horizon. No fields need yet cover the earth. Nothing dramatic has to happen. A place simply receives enough labour, memory, dead, food, and expectation that it becomes increasingly difficult to imagine life without it. Once that happens, migration is no longer the unquestioned answer. Leaving no longer feels like movement. It begins to feel like severance. Once a place begins to hold people, the ground itself starts to change under their hands. Not dramatically at first. There are no endless fields rolling to the horizon, no ploughs cutting deep lines into the earth, no villages yet organized around full agricultural routine. The first change is smaller, slower, and far more intimate. It begins with attention, a group that expects to return to the same place, or remain there longer than before, starts noticing not only what the land offers, but how it might be encouraged to offer more. That is one of the quiet thresholds between foraging and something else. People have always altered their environments to some degree. They burn brush to open ground, scatter seeds accidentally, favour certain plants through repeated harvesting, disturb soil around camps, transport species without intending to, and shape animal behaviour through pressure and presence. Human beings are ecological disruptors long before they become farmers, but once staying becomes more common. Those disruptions can become habits, and habits, repeated enough times, begin to look like management. A stand of wild grain near a settlement is no longer just a lucky occurrence. It becomes part of a remembered pattern. The people know when it ripens, how thickly it grows, which patches are easier to harvest, which soils seem to favour it, which slopes hold moisture longest. If some of the grain is cut before it falls, if some is gathered and stored, if some spills near camp or along repeatedly used paths, a subtle feedback begins. The land around the settlement becomes different from land farther away, not wholly transformed, but nudged. A plant that was once merely found is now, in some small way, anticipated. This anticipation matters because it changes the logic of time. Foragers operate with deep knowledge of seasonality, but cultivation adds a new relationship to delay. One does something in the present not merely to take advantage of what is already there, but to improve the chance that something desirable will be there later. Even very low-level tending introduces this principle. Soil may be disturbed in ways that benefit certain species. Competing plants may be cleared. Seeds may be placed. However casually at first, in spots where people expect to return. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate exactly where one draws the line between opportunistic management and true cultivation. But the broad shift is unmistakable. Human beings start participating more directly in the reproductive future of their food. This does not happen in isolation from older ways of life. Hunting continues, gathering continues, fishing, trapping, seasonal movement, and opportunistic exploitation of varied environments all remain essential. The earliest tending practices are not a clean replacement for foraging. They are additions layered onto it, and for a long time they may seem supplementary rather than transformative. Yet their significance lies precisely in that modesty. The world does not change all at once. It changes because small interventions, repeated across seasons, begin altering what people expect from a place and what a place yields in return. The Near East again offers some of the clearest evidence for this long transition, especially in the arc stretching from late Epipaleolithic communities into the pre-pottery Neolithic. Wild cereals such as barley and einkorn become increasingly central in some regions, and over time the signs of human manipulation, harvesting pressure, storage, and eventual domestication accumulate. But even here, the story is not tidy. No single explanation fully accounts for why cultivation intensifies when and where it does. In some places, rich wild stands may have supported near-sedentary life before true domestication. In others, climatic instability may have made managed food production more attractive or more necessary. What survives in the record suggests experimentation, not sudden invention. This experimentation is easy to romanticize, but it should not be. Early cultivation is labor. Gathering wild grain in quantity already requires time, tools, coordination, and processing. Grinding seeds into usable food is physically demanding. Tending plots, even small ones, means repeated attention to the same location. The burden may fall unevenly across age and sex, as it so often does in human societies, though the details vary and remain debated. In any case, this is not a story of instant abundance. It is a story of commitment. The more a group relies on managed plants, the more tightly its future becomes bound to the success of a place. That bond may begin almost invisibly. A family stores gathered seeds and notices that some patches near camp grow better after repeated use. A community lingers because the surrounding stands remain productive enough to justify the effort. People start clearing, cutting, or sowing in ways that make return increasingly attractive. This settlement becomes not just a place among resources, but a place linked to resources that are now partly shaped by human action. Once that happens, leaving is no longer merely a matter of changing location. It means abandoning work already invested in the future. There is also a deeper emotional shift hidden inside this process. Hunting and gathering in mobile societies depend on reading what the world offers when one arrives. Tending depends on confidence that one will still be there when the world answers back. That confidence is fragile. Crops fail. Weather changes. Animals eat what was meant for humans. Seeds do not sprout. Flood or drought can erase months of effort with almost insulting speed. Yet the willingness to continue despite that uncertainty suggests a new relationship to the land, less like following a living world across space, more like negotiating with one chosen patch of it through time. The tools begin to reflect this change. Sickles with gloss from repeated cutting of cereals, grinding stones worn smooth by laborious processing, storage facilities dug or built with increasing care, baskets and containers suited to holding gathered or cultivated food in significant volume. These are not merely objects. They are commitments made tangible. Heavy equipment only makes sense in a world where staying has become normal enough to justify its inconvenience. The same is true for built storage. A pit filled with food is a promise to the future, but also a risk, because it creates something worth defending and something disastrous to lose. This is where the old mobile inheritance starts to weaken in practical ways. A highly mobile group can respond to local decline by moving elsewhere. A group that has invested labor into nearby food resources becomes less agile. Its attention narrows. Its routines thicken. Its dependence deepens. Scholars still debate whether this should be seen as progress, adaptation, or trap. And the answer is probably all three. Managed food can support denser population and longer residence. But it also locks people into cycles of work and vulnerability that movement once helped them avoid. There is a lesser-known detail that reveals the strangeness of this moment. Early cultivation does not necessarily make life easier nutritionally or socially. In many later agricultural populations, health markers often worsen in certain respects compared with the varied foraging diets. Workloads increase, disease environments intensify, social inequality can deepen. That does not mean the first tending communities immediately suffer all these later consequences, but it does caution against seeing cultivation as an obvious improvement. The first steps toward growing food are not a simple march toward comfort. They are responses to local opportunities and pressures that gradually create a different kind of dependency. And yet, once those dependencies begin, they generate their own momentum. Stored seed invites planting. Managed stands invite protection. Repeated harvests justify better tools. Better tools make larger harvests possible. Larger harvests support more people. And more people increase the need for reliable food. What begins as one strategy among many starts becoming the central axis of life. The future no longer lies mostly in movement across a wide landscape. It begins to lie in the success or failure of the same ground year after year. This may be why the emotional world of early settlement changes so profoundly. A foraging camp can be left when conditions turn bad. A place with tended resources resists abandonment, not because people are irrational, but because they now have more to lose. They know the patches, they know the timing, they know what has already been sown, cut, stored, and prepared. Their labor has become geographically concentrated. The land holds not only memory and the dead, but expectation. That expectation is powerful enough to keep people in place longer than older instincts might advise. What survives in the record suggests that this transition unfolds unevenly over long spans of time. Some communities experiment and then retreat, others intensify. Some remain mixed economies for centuries or millennia. There is no single first farmer in the mythical sense. No clean dividing line where humanity steps out of one age and into another. But the broad pattern remains one of the most consequential in history. Staying makes tending worthwhile, and tending makes staying harder to abandon. By now the settlement is no longer just a favoured camp or a practical anchor. It has begun to generate a new type of future. Children grow up around stored food. Adults schedule labor around ripening plants and familiar stands. Certain seasons become less about deciding where to go, and more about preparing what will happen here. The horizon is still there, open as ever, but more of life now faces inward, toward the known ground. This is how the seeds of a different future are planted, long before anyone could name that future clearly, not through revelation, not through sudden genius, through repeated acts of care and calculation, through hands returning to the same soil, through the growing conviction that survival no longer requires chasing the world across distance, but persuading one small part of it to remain generous. That conviction will change everything, though for now it still looks modest, a store of grain. A polished stone, a patch of disturbed earth, and a people beginning to trust the place beneath them more than the road beyond it. A landscape can persuade people to linger. Memory can persuade them to return. Cultivation can persuade them to invest labour in the same ground again and again. But none of that is enough by itself. A way of life changes permanently only when what begins as a practical convenience hardens into a shared expectation. The first true refusal to migrate is not the moment one family stays too long by a river, or one season of abundance delays departure. It is the moment remaining becomes social law without needing to be written, when the group begins to act as though leaving is no longer the normal answer. That transformation is quieter than conquest, and more consequential than any single invention. It happens through ordinary pressures. Someone repairs a house because everyone assumes it will still matter next season. Someone fills a storage pit because others are counting on it. Someone clears ground, tends a stand of grain, watches over a boundary, or buries kin beneath a floor because the settlement has ceased to be temporary in the mind of the community. What was once preference is now obligation. What was once a useful place is now the place. This is where the story stops being ecological and becomes deeply social. Human beings can live with considerable uncertainty if they remain mobile. Movement allows disagreement to dissolve into distance. Groups can fission, rejoin, alter seasonal patterns, or leave strained relationships behind with the landscape itself providing separation. A more settled life changes that balance. People wake in the same proximity. They depend more directly on one another's labour. The successful storage of food, maintenance of structures, management of resources, and defense of place all require cooperation that is more regular, more visible, and often more enforceable. The settlement, in other words, begins to create expectations about behaviour. What survives in the archaeological record rarely preserves rules, but it preserves patterns, and patterns can be revealing. Repeated house forms suggest conventions. Shared burial practices imply norms. Standardized use of space hints at agreed rhythms of daily life. Storage on a meaningful scale suggests trust, coordination, or both. Refuse disposal, hearth placement, repair habits, and the clustering of structures all point to communities learning how to live not just near one another, but through one another. The evidence remains incomplete, but what survives suggests that staying becomes collective not because every individual prefers it equally, but because the structure of daily life begins to demand it. There must have been resistance. It is difficult to imagine otherwise. An older mobile inheritance does not vanish simply because a place becomes productive. Some members of a community would likely remain more inclined toward movement, more sensitive to local depletion, more suspicious of dependence on one patch of land, or more irritated by the closeness and obligation of settled life. The archaeological record is not generous enough to preserve those disputes directly, but the social logic almost requires them. A group in transition would contain multiple instincts at once: attachment and caution, ambition and unease, investment and escape. Scholars still debate how much this process is driven by consensus and how much by necessity. In some cases, remaining may have seemed attractive enough that the community moved toward it with little visible strain. In others, climatic shifts, local abundance, demographic pressure, or the growth of social and ritual investment may have made leaving increasingly difficult, even for those who wanted to preserve older mobility. No single explanation fully accounts for the change because no human community is ever moved by one cause alone. What happens instead is convergence. Environmental opportunity meets emotional attachment. Food management meets burial. Repeated return meets social memory. And together, these forces begin to close the door behind a people who once lived with the horizon always open. One of the clearest ways this collective shift reveals itself is through labour that only makes sense if others also remain. A single household might store food for a short return, but maintaining shared spaces, repairing communal features, or investing in structures beyond the needs of the moment suggests a broader commitment. At some sites, architecture becomes substantial enough that it would be irrational without an expectation of continuity extending beyond a few individuals. That expectation is social before it is political. It rests on the belief that the group, not just the self, is staying. This has consequences for identity. In a mobile world, identity often travels through kinship, memory, root, and practice. In an increasingly settled world, place itself begins joining that structure more forcefully. People are not only of one another, they are of here. That difference may sound small, but it is enormous. Once a place becomes central to group identity, leaving it can feel like disloyalty, not merely adaptation. The settlement becomes a moral landscape. Ritual may intensify this process. The evidence from early sedentary and semi-sedentary communities often suggests that shared symbolic practices grow alongside investment in place. Burials beneath dwellings, curated skulls in some Neolithic contexts, communal structures, repeated use of particular spaces, and other signs of ritual continuity imply that remaining in one place is not merely practical. It is sanctified. The dead, the living, the remembered, and the expected are all gathered into the same ground. This gives the settlement gravity that extends beyond subsistence. People stay not only because the place feeds them, but because it now contains their history in a form movement would disperse. There is a revealing psychological consequence here. As long as migration remains normal, a failed season is a call to movement. But once remaining becomes collective expectation, failure becomes something to be endured, repaired, explained, or managed. That creates resilience in one sense and fragility in another. A community that stays can build, plan, store, and remember more deeply, but it can also become trapped in commitments that outlast the conditions which made them sensible. The first refusal to migrate is therefore not just a triumph of rootedness. It is the beginning of a long human habit of staying too long because too much has already been placed in one location. Children again matter enormously. Adults who still remember more mobile patterns may experience staying as compromise. Children born into the settlement experience it as reality. Their friendships, routines, fears, chores, and earliest understanding of belonging are formed around fixed structures and repeated spaces. They do not simply inhabit the settlement, they absorb its assumptions. This is how a temporary solution becomes culture. What one generation negotiates, the next may inherit as obvious. At that point, migration does not disappear, but it becomes deviation from the center rather than the center itself. This collective shift also begins producing internal differentiation. Once people remain together in one place, labor can become more specialized, responsibility more visible, and stored goods more unevenly controlled. Even before full agricultural states or formal elites emerge, the conditions for social comparison grow stronger. Who tends the stores, who controls access, who speaks for the dead, who organizes repairs, who mediates conflict over space, effort, and return. A mobile group can often keep wealth thin because movement punishes accumulation. A settled group permits thickness, and thickness invites power. The first refusal to migrate may therefore also be the first subtle invitation to hierarchy. A lesser-known but important clue lies in the architecture of repetition itself. Some settlements show rebuilding on the same spot over and over, with older structures buried beneath newer ones. This is not merely practical reuse of favourable ground. It suggests continuity valued for its own sake. To build where ancestors built, to repair where earlier dwellings stood, to lay a new floor above an older one, is to enact permanence materially. The settlement becomes layered not just in sediment, but in legitimacy. Each rebuilding says, in effect, that this place remains ours because it has already been ours. What survives in the record suggests that once this logic takes hold, the community no longer merely occupies land. It begins to defend an arrangement of life. Leaving becomes costly not only because of food and shelter, but because departure would unravel a dense web of tasks, meanings, obligations, and inherited expectations. The refusal to migrate is no longer a reaction to one good season. It has become a social fact. That does not mean everyone is content. A settled life can intensify quarrels, expose inequality, constrain mobility, and make environmental failure more dangerous. Some may still leave, splinter away, or maintain wider circuits beyond the core settlement. Others may stay reluctantly because family, dead, stores, or custom bind them more tightly than desire. But that is exactly the point. A collective way of life does not need universal enthusiasm. It only needs enough pressure, enough advantage, and enough inherited structure to keep reproducing itself. And once it does, history changes direction. The group that once watched the horizon for signs that it was time to go now watches one another, the stores, the houses, the familiar ground, the boundary where use becomes claim. Departure is no longer the first instinct. The instinct now is to hold, to mend, to wait out the season, to rely on labour already invested, to trust that staying will still make sense tomorrow. Sometimes that trust will be rewarded, sometimes it will not. But the old default has been broken. The road is still there. But it's no longer the law. The law, though no one has written it, now lives in shared routine. This is where we remain. The moment a people chooses to remain, space stops being neutral. Ground that once served as a temporary convenience begins to acquire edges. A path becomes a path because feet repeat it, because hands carry loads along it, because children know where it leads, before they are old enough to ask. A shelter becomes a house not only when it is strengthened, but when the space around it is organized and defended as if its position matters. The land outside is still vast, still open, still full of game trails and distant water and remembered routes. But the land inside begins to change its character. It is no longer simply used, it is held. That shift may be one of the most consequential in all of human history, because held space creates a new kind of tension. Mobility once softened conflict by keeping boundaries blurred. A group might favour certain hunting grounds or seasonal camps, but the logic of movement allowed for overlap, avoidance, and rebalancing. Once people invest in structures, stores, manage plants, burial grounds, and shared routines at one location, ambiguity becomes harder to tolerate. The settlement must know where it begins and where it ends, even if those lines are not marked in the modern sense. Boundaries first exist in practice, in memory, in habit, and in warning. What survives in the archaeological record often reveals this before it states it directly. Houses cluster in ways that suggest patterned use of space. Open areas appear between them, perhaps for work, gathering, animals, or ritual. Storage features occupy specific locations: walls, ditches, stone alignments, and other barriers begin to appear in some places, though not everywhere and not always for the same reason. The evidence remains incomplete, and scholars still debate whether every early enclosure is defensive, symbolic, hydraulic, or social. But what survives in the record suggests that once people stay, they start organizing space as though access matters. Jericho is one of the most famous examples precisely because it forces the question. Its early stone wall and tower, dating back to the pre-pottery Neolithic A, have been interpreted in different ways for decades. Some see defense, others argue for flood control, communal labor, or symbolic architecture. No single explanation fully accounts for the structure with complete certainty, and that uncertainty is important. But whatever the exact function, the scale of the work says something unmistakable. People are no longer lightly occupying this landscape. They are investing labor into shaping it, protecting it, or defining it in ways that would have made little sense in a purely mobile existence. The wall itself matters less than the mindset behind it. To build a barrier, whether against water, animals, strangers, or chaos in a more abstract sense, is to declare that what lies within deserves continuity. It says that leaving is not the first solution. It says that this place is worth defending rather than abandoning. That is a profound break from the older inheritance of motion. A mobile people confronted with local danger can move away. A settled people begins to build against it. Fields extend this logic outward, even before fully domesticated agriculture covers the land. Zones of repeated harvesting, managed growth, and expected return create invisible extensions of the settlement. A stand of cereals nearby, a patch of disturbed soil, an area cleared for repeated use, an orchard in much later contexts, or even a reliable fishing point increasingly tied to one community's routines. These are all forms of territorial imagination. The resource is no longer just part of a wider landscape. It is part of the place's future. That future becomes harder to share casually. This may be where one of the oldest human contradictions begins to harden. The settlement promises security, but it also creates vulnerability. Food stores attract theft. Productive nearby land attracts rivals. Water sources become points of pressure. A burial ground, once established, cannot easily be moved without emotional and symbolic cost. The people who stay gain continuity, but they lose flexibility. They are now visible, locatable, and in some sense, predictable. Others know where to find them. Scholars still debate how early serious territorial conflict emerges in settled communities, and it would be irresponsible to treat all early villages as armed fortresses waiting for attack. Many may have been mostly cooperative within broad social networks, linked by exchange, intermarriage, and shared traditions. Yet no serious reading of early Sedentism can ignore the fact that fixed resources generate fixed disputes. When land and labour become anchored in one place, so do grievances. The old option of graceful departure becomes more expensive with every season that investment accumulates. There are subtler consequences as well. Boundaries do not only divide one group from another, they divide insiders from outsiders within thought itself. Once a community learns to think spatially in terms of inside and outside, near and far, ours and not ours, those categories can seep into identity. People begin to belong not only through kinship and memory, but through proximity to held space. A person from beyond the settlement is no longer simply unfamiliar. They are someone approaching a place that matters materially. That changes hospitality, suspicion, exchange, and the emotional temperature of encounter. Walls, when they appear, also reorganize labour. They require planning, coordination, and the ability to mobilize work beyond immediate household survival. The same is true for maintaining communal spaces, clearing approaches, watching access points, protecting stores, and managing surrounding land. In a mobile existence, collective labour certainly exists, but its products are often transient. In a more settled life, labour leaves scars and structures. It hardens into the environment. That means cooperation becomes visible in stone, earth, timber, and repeated layout. It also means disagreement can become visible in neglect, collapse, or contested use. A lesser-known but revealing detail is that boundaries are often first enforced not by grand warfare, but by routine. Who gathers from which patch? Who draws from which spring? Which hearth belongs to which household? Where waste is thrown? Where the dead are buried? Which structures are repaired first? How near one dwelling can be built to another? These may seem mundane compared with later armies and fortresses, but they are the true beginnings of territorial life. Civilization does not start with a map. It starts with repeated decisions about access. The settlement itself becomes increasingly legible as an ordered environment. Children learn what can be entered and what should not be touched. Adults learn which areas carry shared obligations and which carry household authority. Visitors, if welcomed, are received through social expectations already rooted in space. The environment begins instructing behaviour. A wall, a lane, a doorway, a storage area, a courtyard, a burial zone. These are not only physical features. They are lessons in belonging. There is also a deep irony here. The first settled communities may have remained in one place partly because the surrounding environment was rich and generous enough to make staying worthwhile. But the more they stayed, the more they carved that environment into defended and managed zones. The land that first held them through abundance gradually becomes land that must be protected through effort. What begins as gift becomes obligation. What begins as ease becomes structure. No single explanation fully accounts for how quickly this hardening occurs. Some communities may have remained relatively open and flexible for long periods. Others may have developed sharper internal and external boundaries surprisingly early. Regional ecology, local demography, exchange networks, ritual traditions, and climatic pressures all matter. But the broad pattern remains. Fixed settlement produces spatial seriousness. The land is no longer just traversed. It is arranged, remembered, divided, and sometimes defended. One can imagine the emotional consequences in daily life. A person wakes not simply in a shelter, but in a house whose walls have been maintained by familiar hands. Outside lies not just open terrain, but nearby ground associated with food, labour, and risk. Beyond that lies the unknown, or at least the less controlled. The horizon has not disappeared, but it has lost authority. The world is now read outward from a centre. That centre can feel comforting. It can also feel heavy. The people who remain must keep remaining through work. Walls do not defend themselves. Fields do not tend themselves. Boundaries must be remembered, negotiated, and sometimes enforced. A mobile band can survive by reading movement well. A settled community must now survive by holding form against movement against floodwater, scarcity, strangers, animals, weather, and the restless old instinct to leave when things become difficult. And still they stay. They stay long enough that paths deepen into habit and habit deepens into claim. They stay long enough that buildings need maintenance, that nearby land becomes part of the settlement's expected future, that the inside begins to feel morally different from the outside. This is the point at which refusal to migrate becomes something more than endurance. It becomes geography. The people have not merely chosen a place, they have begun to divide the world around it. Then the climate shifts, and the old horizon no longer offers the same promise it once did. For most of human history, movement is an answer because the world remains broad enough to answer back. If one valley dries, another may still hold water. If one hunting ground fails, another may still carry game. If a familiar route becomes difficult, memory can open alternatives. The land is dangerous, but it is plural. Survival depends on the ability to move through that plurality with intelligence. Yet there are periods in prehistory when the balance tightens, when climates wobble. Rainfall patterns change, vegetation retreats or rearranges itself, and the wider world becomes harder to trust. Under those conditions, staying in one known place can begin to feel less like stubbornness and more like strategy. This is one of the great paradoxes at the root of settlement. It is easy to imagine sedentarism emerging only from abundance, from lucky landscapes so rich that people simply see no reason to leave. And certainly abundance matters. But what survives in the record suggests that stress matters too. Some communities do not become more rooted because the world grows easier. They become more rooted because the world beyond their known ground grows less reliable, more erratic, or more costly to navigate. The refusal to migrate may not always be a refusal of opportunity. Sometimes it is a refusal of worsening uncertainty. The end of the last ice age does not arrive as one smooth improvement. It is a long and complicated transition, marked by warming trends but also reversals, oscillations, local instability, and sudden disruptions. In the Near East, where some of the earliest evidence for increasing sedentism appears, this instability becomes especially important. The Natufian period emerges in relatively favourable conditions, with some communities exploiting rich stands of wild cereals and other resources in ways that support longer occupation. But later, during the Younger Dryas beginning around 10,900 BCE, conditions in parts of the region appear to become colder and drier again. The exact local effects vary, and scholars still debate the scale and regional patterning of the impact. But what survives in the record suggests that these climatic stresses may have intensified the pressure to manage food more directly and to hold tightly to the most reliable places. A drying landscape changes the emotional map of the world. Distance becomes more expensive when every uncertain mile carries the risk of finding nothing better than what was left behind. Water sources matter more sharply. Productive stands of plants become more precious. The familiar spring, the marsh edge that still holds birds, the valley floor where moisture lingers after weak rains, the slope where grain still comes up despite a harsh season, these places acquire a gravity stronger than simple habit. The wider landscape may still be open, but its openness begins to feel empty rather than promising. No single explanation fully accounts for why some groups respond to climatic stress by intensifying mobility, while others root themselves more deeply. Both strategies are possible, and both likely occur in different places and times. Some populations may range farther in search of resources. Others may contract around dependable ecological refuges, those unusually resilient pockets of water, plant life, and animal presence that remain viable, even when surrounding country becomes less generous. What survives in the archaeological record suggests that in some regions, known places become disproportionately valuable, precisely because so much else becomes unreliable. This helps explain why certain early settlements persist in ecologically strategic locations. Springs, river margins, Oasis-like basins, lake edges, marshlands, and other moisture-retaining landscapes act as anchors when the broader environment grows more severe. A people living close to one of these zones may understand very well that conditions elsewhere are worsening. That knowledge does not always send them outward. It can instead convince them to hold fast, to tighten their relationship with the patch of ground that still answers. There is something psychologically profound in that turn. The older mobile inheritance trusts motion because motion offers alternatives, but climatic instability can make alternatives feel thin. When every direction contains risk, the known place gains value beyond its absolute productivity. Familiarity itself becomes a resource. Knowing exactly when a pool shrinks, how deep a spring remains in a bad year, where shade preserves moisture longest, or which nearby species survive a dry season can mean the difference between endurance and collapse. The land already learned through years of repeated residence becomes not merely home, but expertise embodied in geography. This may also be one of the moments when experimentation with cultivation ceases to be optional in spirit, even if it remains small in scale. Under volatile conditions, the temptation to encourage, protect, or increase dependable local food sources becomes stronger. Wild cereals once harvested opportunistically may be watched more carefully. Disturbed ground near settlements may be used more deliberately. Storage becomes more urgent, not just convenient. Labour spent securing the local future may begin to outweigh the risks of remaining in place through harder seasons. Scholars still debate how direct the relationship is between episodes like the Younger Dryas and the origins of cultivation, and it would be too simple to reduce an immense human transition to one climate event. Still, the overlap between environmental instability and intensifying human investment in fixed places is difficult to ignore. There is another way climate can close the horizon by altering animal movement. Herd animals do not obey human preferences. Their routes respond to changing vegetation, rainfall, predation, and terrain conditions. A more mobile foraging life depends heavily on reading and following these patterns. But if those patterns become less predictable, if key prey species become scarcer in familiar circuits, or shift in ways that are harder to track efficiently, the returns on wide movement can diminish. Under such conditions, broad-spectrum subsistence near a reliable settlement combining small game, fish, birds, gathered plants, stored seeds, and whatever local hunting remains possible may begin to look less like compromise and more like prudence. What survives in faunal and botanical assemblages at some sites hints at exactly this kind of adaptation. Diets can broaden, resource use can intensify. People may exploit smaller species, aquatic food sources, or labour-intensive plant foods more heavily when large game becomes less dependable. None of this is glamorous, and it is certainly not effortless. In fact, it often means more work. But more work in one known landscape may still be preferable to greater uncertainty spread across a wider one. This is how the burden of staying can first appear as a kind of safety. The evidence remains incomplete, as it always does in stories this deep in time, and one must be careful not to portray climate as an irresistible force that simply pushes human beings into settlement. People are not passive leaves in a weather system. They interpret, improvise, resist, and choose within constraints. Yet constraints matter. A drying phase, a cold reversal, shrinking woodlands, stressed grasslands, or reduced predictability and seasonal abundance can alter the field of sensible options. When that happens, the familiar place can become more valuable than the distant possibility. There is a lesser-known detail here that deserves attention. Climatic stress does not always make populations more scattered. It can also make them more concentrated. If reliable water and food become patchier, then more people may be drawn toward the same resilient locales. That concentration can intensify pressure on those places, accelerating the need for storage, management, boundaries, and social coordination. In other words, environmental difficulty may not merely encourage staying. It may force communities to become more organized about staying, because valuable places become crowded as well as precious. This may help explain why the earliest rooted communities often seem to stand at the edge of contradiction. They remain because their landscape still works, but the very act of remaining increases pressure on the landscape. More hands gather from nearby stands. More mouths rely on stores. More structures occupy the same footprint. More dead lie in the same soil. The known place grows indispensable at the exact moment it also becomes more fragile. The refusal to migrate is therefore sharpened by danger, not protected from it. One can imagine the emotional atmosphere of such a settlement in a bad year. The air is drier. The surrounding hills offer less confidence. Tracks are harder to read because fewer animals pass. The old routes are still known, but they do not shine with the same promise. People watch the water level closely. They measure stores more carefully. They harvest with a seriousness that borders on anxiety. To leave now would not feel like freedom. It would feel like stepping away from the last place one still understands. And so they remain. Not because all fear has vanished, but because fear has become directional. The danger is no longer only in staying too long. The danger is now also in going out too far. That is a different world from the one that shaped most of human existence. It is a world in which rootedness can begin to seem rational, even to those who remember mobility as wisdom. This is how climate closes the horizon without building a wall. It does not physically trap a people. It changes the balance of trust between the known and the unknown. The wider land still exists, but it yields less confidence. The centre, though imperfect, still holds. And when a community has already invested labour, memory, dead, stores, and hope into that centre, even a difficult climate can strengthen the instinct to stay. The place is no longer merely productive. It is survivable in ways the outside world no longer clearly is. From here, the logic of settlement grows heavier. A people who once remained because the land was good now remains because the rest of the land may no longer be better. That is a more dangerous kind of loyalty. It binds communities not only through abundance, but through narrowing options. And once human beings begin staying because leaving feels worse, the story darkens. The home they have made is becoming not just an anchor, but a necessity. By the time a community reaches this point, the old freedom of movement has not vanished entirely, but it has become expensive in ways earlier generations would have understood immediately. Too much now depends on remaining. The dead are here, the stores are here, the built spaces are here, the nearby stands of grain, the familiar water, the repaired walls, the grinding stones too heavy to carry, the routines that structure labour and expectation. All of it gathers into one argument repeated day after day: stay, endure, adjust, hold. Yet that same argument conceals a problem as old as settlement itself. A place that keeps people alive long enough will also begin to weigh on them. This is the burden of staying. It is the quiet cost hidden beneath the first appearance of stability. Movement once spread pressure across landscapes and seasons. Staying concentrates it. Food is taken repeatedly from the same surrounding zone. Waste gathers. Houses crowd closer. Water sources serve more bodies. More often. Illness. which in a mobile life may have struggled to travel far or linger long, now finds a more favourable environment. Tension no longer thins out over distance. It accumulates in the same rooms, around the same hearths, along the same lanes, beneath the same roofs patched one season after another. The first burden is ecological. Even a productive landscape can be worn down when too many expectations are attached to it. Wild grasses harvested heavily year after year may thin or shift. Nearby game grows wary or scarce. Wood for fuel and construction must be gathered from ever greater distances if local stands are repeatedly cut. Soil around settlements is trampled, compacted, disturbed, and filled with the residue of daily life. None of this necessarily produces immediate catastrophe. In many cases, people adapt, change their practices, widen procurement zones, or intensify management. But what survives in the record suggests that the simple act of remaining creates environmental feedback. A place used continuously must now bear human weight in a way earlier camps never had to. This ecological burden is one reason the first settled communities so often become more labour-intensive rather than less. The dream of staying is not ease. It is work reorganised. If nearby resources no longer suffice effortlessly, then more time must be spent gathering, tending, storing, repairing, hauling, and protecting. A mobile group can sometimes answer local decline by leaving it behind. A settled group answers by trying harder. That response can succeed for a time. It can also pull people into a cycle where stability depends on increasing effort. The second burden is bodily. Settlement changes health in ways that are rarely visible to the people living through the transition, but are often legible much later in bone. Archaeologists and bioanthropologists have long observed that more sedentary and agricultural lifeways can bring a mixed and often troubling package of consequences: heavier, repetitive labour, nutritional narrowing in some contexts, increased exposure to pathogens, greater contact with waste, crowding, and the social stress that comes with denser cohabitation. The exact timing and severity vary widely, and one must be careful not to project the full burdens of later farming villages onto every early sedentary community. Still, the pattern is strong enough to matter. Staying together creates a different disease environment. In a mobile world, people are certainly not healthy in any romantic sense. They face injury, infection, hunger, childbirth danger, violence, and exposure. But they do not usually pile those risks into the same fixed environment in quite the same way. Once homes, middens, food stores, and repeated water use converge in one settlement. The microbial world changes with them. Parasites find continuity. Contaminated spaces linger. Domestic animals, where they begin to cluster more closely with humans in later contexts, complicate matters further. The evidence remains incomplete for the earliest phases, but the broader logic is difficult to escape. Stillness allows invisible things to remain with people just as surely as memory does. There is also the burden of time. A mobile life contains uncertainty, but it also contains escape from maintenance. A place left behind ceases making demands. A place stayed in never stops asking. Roofs sag, hearths must be cleaned, walls crack, storage pits must be checked, paths erode, fields or managed stands require watching, water access changes, refuse needs removal. The settlement consumes labour not because it is failing, but because it exists. The more permanent life becomes, the more of it is spent preserving permanence. That preservation is rarely equal. Some households likely work harder than others. Some control more stores, better spaces, stronger structures, or more secure access to nearby resources. Once labour and wealth begin to concentrate spatially, inequality can begin to thicken even before formal classes emerge. Scholars still debate how early substantial hierarchy appears in different regions, and the evidence varies greatly. But no single explanation fully accounts for early sedentism without acknowledging that fixed settlement creates the conditions for comparison. In a mobile band, possessions are limited by transport. In a settled community, stores can grow, objects can accumulate, and differences can persist from one season to the next. This introduces the social burden of staying. People who remain in one place do not merely see one another more, they become trapped in one another's patterns. Effort is observed, neglect is observed, generosity and selfishness become harder to hide. A quarrel that might once have dissolved into distance must now be endured under the same roofline of community expectation. Kinship may deepen, but so may resentment. A fixed place offers continuity. Yet continuity can preserve conflict as efficiently as it preserves memory. One of the strangest consequences of this is that stability begins producing anxiety of its own. A family with stores worries about losing them. A household with stronger walls worries about damage. A community that has invested heavily in one place worries about drought, theft, crop failure, flood, pests, sickness, and the intentions of nearby groups. The more there is to lose, the more human attention bends toward protecting it. In that sense, settlement creates a new emotional economy. People may feel safer in some ways, but they also become more vulnerable to fear precisely because so much of life now depends on the survival of a single centre. Burial intensifies this emotional burden further. A place containing ancestors is not easy to abandon even when conditions worsen. The dead lend meaning to the settlement, but they also help bind the living to it. What survives in the record suggests that in many early communities, the relationship between house and burial is too intimate to be accidental. To sleep above or beside the dead is to live in a landscape made heavy with obligation. This may strengthen group continuity and identity. It may also make practical withdrawal far more difficult. Leaving a place of ancestors can feel like betrayal, even when survival might recommend it. Children experience the burden differently, but no less deeply. Those born into a settled environment inherit not only home, but expectation. They grow within cycles of maintenance, work, storage, and return. They learn that food does not only appear through movement across a wide world, but through repeated effort applied to a familiar one. This can make life feel more structured, perhaps more coherent, but it also narrows the horizon of possibility. The road remains. Yet it no longer carries the same dignity in the imagination. To leave is no longer simply one adult strategy among others. It is deviation from the centre of social life. There are lesser-known clues to this burden in the archaeology of architecture itself. Houses rebuilt again and again on the same footprint suggest continuity, but they also suggest constraint. To rebuild in place may honour memory, preserve claim, or simply use familiar ground efficiently. Yet each rebuilding also deepens entanglement. A structure is not just maintained, it is inherited. Layers of occupation accumulate one above another like obligations stacked in earth. The settlement becomes difficult to alter because the past lies directly underneath the present. Then there is the possibility of failure. A community that remains in one place through worsening conditions must sometimes confront the terrible fact that investment does not guarantee success. Stores can run low, wells can fail, disease can spread, managed resources can disappoint, social cohesion can break under pressure, and when leaving has become emotionally, materially, and ritually costly, The community may stay longer than is wise. This is one of the darkest truths in the story. The same rootedness that makes civilization possible can also make suffering harder to escape. What survives in skeletal remains from later settled populations often speaks quietly of this tension. Worn joints, repetitive strain, nutritional stress, evidence of infectious burden, occasional trauma. These signs do not tell one single story, and they must not be flattened into a universal tale of misery. Many settled communities were resilient, inventive, and capable of sustaining rich social and symbolic lives. But the bones remind us of something the ruins alone cannot. Staying is not restful, it is costly in the body. And still, despite all this, people continue to remain. That persistence is perhaps the clearest sign that settlement has crossed from strategy into necessity. The burdens are not hidden, yet they are endured because the alternative no longer seems simpler. Movement would mean abandoning more than a camp. It would mean leaving behind stores, structures, graves, routines, and perhaps identity itself. The place that once attracted through abundance now holds through weight. This is how the first refusal to migrate begins revealing its price. It creates security, but also dependence, continuity, but also crowding, memory, but also obligation, labour, but also unequal reward. Health in some respects may improve, in others worsen. The human world grows thicker, more organised, more productive, and more anxious at the same time. That is the burden of staying. It gives people a centre, and then asks them to carry its full cost. If the first refusal to migrate begins as instinct, pressure, habit, and shared expectation, archaeology is what remains after all of those have gone silent. The people themselves leave no explanation. They leave no surviving voice saying why they stayed, or whether they understood the scale of what they were doing. What they leave instead is heavier and stranger. Floors, walls, burials, pits, seeds, charred grain, broken blades, animal bones split for marrow, stones worn smooth by grinding, post holes where roofs once stood, layers of ash and refuse pressed into the same patch of ground until the settlement becomes a mound, an artificial hill made not by nature, but by the persistence of ordinary life. That is how the first great human refusal enters history as debris with a pattern. Archaeology is powerful precisely because it does not rely on later memory. It looks at what people repeatedly did when they had no idea anyone would ever study them. A single hearth can mean many things. 1,000 hearths rebuilt in the same area across generations mean something else. One burial near a dwelling may be chance. Repeated burials beneath floors suggest a world view. A few scattered seeds could be accident. Dense concentrations of charred plant remains, storage facilities, harvesting tools, and grinding stones begin pointing towards systems of food use that only make sense in a life increasingly anchored to place. The evidence remains incomplete, as it always does, but the accumulation of traces can be astonishingly persuasive. One of the clearest archaeological signs of staying is stratification in the most literal sense. Temporary camps often leave light, discontinuous traces. A more settled life leaves layers. Floors are built, used, swept, repaired, buried, and built over. Hearths are relit in familiar locations. Walls collapse and are replaced. Trash accumulates nearby rather than being abandoned in some distant forgotten camp. Over time, the ground thickens with repeated occupation. In Southwest Asia and elsewhere, this process can create tells, settlement mounds formed from centuries or millennia of rebuilding. Each layer is an argument against constant movement. People do not create such places accidentally. They create them by refusing generation after generation to leave for long. Burials are among the most intimate clues. Human bones found under house floors, near hearths, beneath courtyards, or within the fabric of settlement life reveal a degree of permanence that mobility rarely permits in the same form. The dead are not being left somewhere along a route soon to be forgotten. They are being incorporated into the place itself. In some later early Neolithic contexts, skulls are removed, curated, plastered, displayed, or otherwise treated in ways that suggest complex ancestor veneration. Scholars still debate the precise meanings of these practices, and symbolic interpretation always carries risk. But what survives in the record suggests something fundamental. Place is no longer just where the living happen to be. It is where generations accumulate. Then there are the houses. Architecture is not only shelter, it is expectation made visible. A temporary camp may have structures, sometimes substantial ones, but the difference lies in maintenance, repetition, and density. At early sedentary and semi-sedentary sites, one sees evidence of buildings repaired repeatedly, rebuilt on similar footprints, clustered in patterns that imply continuity of neighborhood and routine. Floors are plastered or compacted. Internal features recur. Entryways matter. Storage areas matter. The very geometry of life changes when people expect to wake again tomorrow and next season in the same enclosed space. Storage pits are among the most revealing features of all. A pit dug into the ground for holding grain, nuts, dried foods, or other supplies is a statement about time. It says the future is expected to happen here. It says labor has been invested in a place because return is assumed. Storage changes risk because it concentrates value. It also changes memory because it requires planning, monitoring, and defense. Archaeologically, storage is one of the quiet fingerprints of commitment. A mobile group can cache food, certainly, but recurrent embedded storage associated with houses and long occupation begins to point toward something deeper. Survival is no longer being spread widely across space. It is being anchored materially. Plant remains tell their own part of the story. Charred seeds survive where soft tissue rots away, and under the right conditions they become tiny witnesses to huge transitions. Wild cereal remains, legumes, gathered fruits, nuts, tubers, and later increasingly domesticated grains can reveal changing patterns of diet, harvesting, processing, and management. The difference between wild and domesticated forms is not always simple to detect, especially in the earlier stages, and scholars still debate timing and sequence at many sites. But botanical evidence allows archaeologists to see whether a community is relying on nearby plant resources intensively enough to suggest long residence, whether storage is occurring, whether harvesting pressure is changing, and whether the line between gathering and cultivation is beginning to blur. Animal bones deepen the picture. Faunal assemblages show which species are being hunted, trapped, fished, or eventually managed more closely. Shifts from large game towards smaller animals, birds, fish, and broad-spectrum exploitation can suggest changing local ecologies or intensified settlement-based subsistence. Age profiles in herd animals, butchery patterns, seasonality, and anatomical representation all help reconstruct how people are using landscapes at certain sites. The combination of faunal and botanical remains hints at communities adjusting their diets to make settled life sustainable, even when older hunting patterns no longer dominate. No single explanation fully accounts for every assemblage. But the broader trend often becomes visible through this patient reading of bone and seed together. Tools matter too, though often in a less dramatic way than ruins or graves. Sickle blades with sheen from harvesting silica-rich cereals, grinding stones worn by repeated processing of seeds, pestles, mortars, storage vessels, and heavy equipment not suited to constant transport all point toward a life less governed by mobility. Use-wear analysis can reveal what tools actually did rather than what they merely resemble. Microscopic traces speak quietly, but sometimes more honestly than grander artifacts. A polished edge, a pattern of chipping, a residue embedded in stone, these are humble forms of evidence, yet they allow archaeologists to reconstruct the repetitive labour of people, staying long enough in one place for their tools to become extensions of settled routine. The bones of the people themselves also preserve part of the argument. Human skeletal remains can indicate diet, workload, trauma, disease burden, and demographic structure. Signs of repetitive strain in joints, dental wear from grain-heavy diets or grit in ground foods, markers of physiological stress, patterns of healed injury, and the age distribution of a burial population all contribute to the wider picture. One must be cautious here. Skeletons do not speak neatly, and no settlement tells a universal story. But what survives in the record suggests that more fixed lifeways can begin altering the body in detectable ways. Staying leaves its mark not just in architecture and refuse, but in muscle attachment, worn teeth, and bones shaped by repeated labour. There is a lesser-known but important clue in the ordinary distribution of space. Archaeologists often map activity areas within settlements where food was processed, where tools were made, where waste accumulated, where people slept, where burials were placed, where special buildings or communal areas may have stood. These distributions reveal not just function, but order. A camp can be improvised. A settlement shows patterns. Patterns repeated across generations imply rules. Even when the rules themselves are gone, the arrangement of life becomes part of the evidence for collective staying. This is one reason early sedentary sites can feel so moving when excavated. They are not ruins in the monumental sense. Often they are low walls, floors, pits, stains in soil, bones in crouched burial positions, fragments of plaster, seeds blackened by accidental fire. But together they reveal something immense. People trusted this place enough to live into it. They buried children here. They repaired houses rather than abandon them. They stored food in the ground and returned for it. They let trash accumulate because tomorrow would happen in the same location. Archaeology, at its best, recovers not just objects but confidence. Yet it also recovers doubt. There are burned layers, abandoned structures, broken sequences of occupation, evidence of stress, rebuilding after destruction, shifts in diet that may indicate pressure, and sometimes signs that staying did not hold forever. Some settlements contract or disappear. Others are reoccupied centuries later by people with different habits. Sedentism is not a simple escalator rising smoothly into civilization. It is an experiment repeatedly attempted, adapted, and sometimes reversed. What survives in the record suggests persistence but not perfection. Communities stay, suffer, adjust, and sometimes fail. That makes the archaeological story more powerful, not less. The first refusal to migrate is not preserved as triumph. It is preserved as evidence of entanglement. The deeper the layers, the clearer it becomes that staying changed what human life could become. The mound grows because people keep repairing instead of leaving. The burials multiply because memory stays local. The tools grow heavier because labour grows rooted. The bones change because the body now serves a more fixed world. The seed remains char in a hearth because a season's work was brought home and processed there. What survives, in the end, is not certainty about motives. Scholars still debate abundance, climate, ritual, territoriality, demography, and early cultivation, and the truth almost certainly lies in some shifting combination of them all. But archaeology shows what the arguments alone cannot. It shows that at certain places, again and again, people acted as if this ground would continue to matter. They built into it, buried into it, worked into it, ate into it, wore pathways through it, turned it into layers thick enough for strangers thousands of years later to cut into with trowels and discover the outline of a new human possibility. The first time humans refuse to migrate is therefore not a single event waiting to be found. It is a pattern emerging from soil. It is visible wherever the earth preserves repeated life in one place, strongly enough to resist forgetting. Beneath the floors and within the pits, among broken tools and scattered bones, the same message appears in different forms. They stayed, not once, but again, not accidentally, but materially. And because they stayed, the ground still remembers them. Among the earliest places where the human decision to remain becomes unmistakably heavy in the soil, Jericho stands like a contradiction in the desert. It sits low in the Jordan Valley, near a powerful spring, in a landscape that can feel harsh, exposed, and unforgiving. At first glance, it is not the sort of place one imagines as the cradle of permanence, and yet water changes everything. In dry country, a dependable spring is not merely useful, it is destiny. The one at Jericho helps make possible a concentration of life that would have been difficult to sustain in the surrounding terrain. Here, perhaps more clearly than almost anywhere else, a fixed place begins pulling human existence into a new shape. Jericho's deep antiquity has made it famous, sometimes too famous, because the site easily attracts simplified stories. It is often presented as the first city, the oldest town, the beginning of urban life itself. The truth is more careful and more interesting. Early Jericho is not a city in the later sense of bureaucratic complexity, written administration, and monumental state power. It is something older and stranger, a place where people gather densely enough, build substantially enough, and remain long enough that the landscape begins to resemble the future without yet fully becoming it. That is precisely why it matters. The spring is the first anchor. Without it, the rest becomes hard to imagine. Water allows continuous occupation where otherwise a mobile strategy would remain more sensible. Around that certainty grows a settlement whose scale already distinguishes it from lighter, more temporary lifeways. Structures appear, are rebuilt, and accumulate. Labour becomes collective. Storage becomes thinkable. Burials remain close. What survives in the record suggests not just repeated visits, but a community increasingly arranged around the assumption that this particular place will continue to matter. Then there is the wall and tower, among the most discussed features of early Jericho. They are impressive not merely because they exist, but because they imply organization, intention, and a scale of labor that exceeds casual necessity. Scholars still debate what exactly these structures are for. Defense is one possibility, and it is the one that often captures the imagination most easily. A wall suggests enemies, a tower suggests watchfulness. Yet the evidence remains incomplete, and other explanations have strong weight as well. Flood control may have mattered greatly in a place where seasonal waters could threaten the settlement. The structures may also have had symbolic or communal significance beyond strictly practical use. No single explanation fully accounts for every detail, but whatever their exact purpose, the broader message is clear. The people at Jericho are not prepared to solve local difficulty by walking away. They are building through it. That may be the true importance of Jericho. It shows not simply that people can stay, but that once they do, they begin devoting labour to preserving the conditions of staying. The wall is not just stone. It is a declaration that continuity is worth work on a scale older mobile traditions would rarely justify. It announces that this settlement is no longer an experiment renewed every season. It has become an arrangement the community is willing to defend, maintain, and perhaps even imagine lasting beyond the memory of any one individual. Jericho is not alone, of course, and it becomes more meaningful when placed alongside other early anchors, rather than treated as a solitary miracle. Abu Hurera, farther north in what is now Syria, tells a different but equally important story. It begins as a hunter-gatherer settlement exploiting rich local resources, including wild cereals, and over long spans of time it preserves evidence relevant to one of the great human transitions, the movement from intensive foraging toward cultivation and farming. Abu Hurera matters because it captures continuity through change. People remain, adapt, intensify, and eventually reshape their subsistence base. The site does not offer a neat before and after lesson. Instead, it reveals how rooted communities can move through environmental and economic transformation without abandoning the place that has already become central. What survives there in plant remains, animal bones, architecture, and settlement sequence suggests a long relationship between people and land, one deep enough that later adaptation is built on earlier attachment. That pattern is crucial. The first refusal to migrate is not just about standing still. It is about staying long enough that new strategies have to emerge locally. Abu Hurera shows how settlement can force innovation not by inspiring genius from nowhere, but by making departure less attractive than reworking life where one already is. Then there is Catal Hoyuk, much later than the earliest Levantine experiments, but invaluable as a demonstration of what prolonged rootedness can become. Here the landscape of settlement has thickened into an extraordinary density of mud brick houses packed close together, entered from roofs, layered over time in a way that turns continuity into architecture itself. Catal Hoyuk is not the first place humans remain, but it is one of the most vivid examples of what happens when the commitment to place becomes total enough to reorganize every aspect of everyday life. Burials lie beneath floors, wall paintings and symbolic installations fill interiors. Houses are rebuilt in place, one above another, until the settlement becomes a physical memory machine. Catal Hoyuk matters not because it marks the exact first refusal, but because it reveals the mature emotional and material consequences of that refusal. The house is no longer merely shelter, it is lineage, burial chamber, workshop, ritual space, storehouse, and the centre of daily existence. Here the cost and power of staying are inseparable. The evidence remains incomplete in many details, and scholars still debate social organisation, hierarchy, ritual meaning, and the exact mechanisms of cohesion. But what survives in the record suggests a society so committed to place that even death remains indoors. That is a long way from the older world of flexible camps and light footprints. Other sites, less famous but equally important, expand the picture. In Malaha, a Natufian site in the Levant, offers early evidence of relatively substantial structures and repeated occupation linked to rich local ecologies. Its burials and material remains hint at communities already living with a density of attachment that complicates any simple division between mobile foragers and settled farmers. Göbekli Tepe, though not a domestic settlement in the same way, raises another possibility. The ritual gathering and symbolic investment in particular places may also help anchor people to landscapes before or alongside full village life. Scholars still debate how to interpret the relationship between such ritual sites and nearby settlement, but the broader lesson is important. Staying may be driven not only by subsistence and climate, but by the magnetic force of shared sacred geography. This is why it is so misleading to search for one birthplace of settled life. The first time humans refuse to migrate is not a single spot on a map. It is a pattern visible across several early anchors, each revealing a different piece of the transformation. Jericho shows concentration around water and collective labour on a striking scale. Abu Hurera shows continuity through subsistence change. Ain Malaha shows that substantial residents can emerge before full agriculture. Catal Hoyuk shows the emotional and architectural depth of long-term rootedness once it matures. Together, these places do not tell one uniform story. They show multiple routes into permanence. There is a lesser-known lesson hiding in that diversity. Early settlements are often not triumphant beginnings. They are negotiations with constraint. Jericho exists because water can hold people in dry country, but water also concentrates risk. Abu Hurera reveals adaptation, but adaptation under pressure is still pressure. Catal Hoyuk glows with symbolic richness, yet its density raises questions about sanitation, smoke, crowding, and social strain. These are not paradise sites. They are places where human beings decide again and again that staying is still preferable to starting over elsewhere. That repeated preference changes the way time operates. In all these places, the present leans visibly on the past. Houses are rebuilt where houses stood before. Burials keep ancestors close. Paths become habitual. The shape of the settlement encodes memory. Each new season adds not a fresh beginning, but another layer. A mobile life can carry memory through story and route. A settled life begins trapping memory in walls, floors, middens, and the physical organization of space. The settlement itself becomes a witness. What survives in the record suggests that this witnessing is part of why such sites endure so strongly in archaeological imagination. They do not simply preserve old objects. They preserve old decisions made material. Every rebuilt wall at Jericho, every seed assemblage at Abu Hurera, every burial beneath a house floor at Catal Hoyuk is evidence of the same underlying human turn, the choice, or the necessity, to remain long enough that place becomes part of the structure of society. Scholars still debate which factors deserve the most weight in each case: water, climate, wild resource abundance, cultivation, population concentration, ritual magnetism, territoriality, memory, and social prestige all have their advocates, and none can be dismissed lightly. No single explanation fully accounts for why these early anchors take hold when they do. Yet perhaps that is the wrong kind of expectation. Human transformations this large are rarely caused by one thing. They occur when multiple pressures converge on landscapes capable of holding them. Jericho and the other early anchors matter because they let that convergence be seen. In their stones, seeds, bones, and rebuilt rooms. The abstract idea of settling down becomes visible as lived reality. This is no longer a story about wandering humans vaguely deciding to stop. It is a story about springs that make concentration possible, about houses that gather the dead and the living together, about communities willing to build in stone rather than solve every problem with departure, about ordinary labour accumulating until a place becomes too thick with life to leave lightly. The road does not vanish at Jericho, or at Abu Hurera, or at Catal Hoyuk. Trade continues, hunting continues, connections continue, but the centre has changed. The known place now exerts more authority than the distant horizon. These settlements are early anchors in the fullest sense. They do not end movement. They reorder it around a fixed heart. And once human life develops hearts like these, history can never return entirely to the oldest, just lighter world. By now the evidence is thick enough to prove that human beings did, in many places and by many routes, begin choosing to remain. What is not thick enough is motive. That is where the story becomes more difficult and, in a way, more revealing. Archaeology can show hearths relit in the same place, floors rebuilt over older floors, grain stored, dead buried beneath houses, walls raised, labour invested, and settlements thickened into mounds. It can show that people stayed. It cannot, on its own, tell us exactly why staying finally outweighed the older wisdom of movement. So the question remains open, and scholars still debate it because no single explanation fully accounts for this transformation in all regions, all climates, and all early communities. The first and perhaps most intuitive explanation is abundance. Some landscapes are simply rich enough to hold people. Springs in dry country, marsh edges dense with bird life and fish, valleys rich in wild cereals, coastlines filled with shellfish and tidal resources, ecotones where forest, grassland, and water meet these places can compress survival into a smaller radius. When enough food, water, shelter, and workable materials exist close together, moving becomes less necessary. In this view, settlement is not initially a desperate gamble or a cultural revolution. It is a practical response to local success. People stay because they can. There is considerable strength in that argument. Sites associated with early Sedentism often do cluster in ecologically favourable zones. The Natufian communities of the Levant, for example, appear in places where wild cereals and varied resources could sustain longer residence than many other foraging landscapes would allow. Jericho without its spring is almost impossible to imagine. Ain Malahar without its lake and surrounding richness would not carry the same pull. In this reading, the first refusal to migrate is not really a refusal at all. It is a recognition that one place now offers enough to make departure irrational, and yet abundance alone feels insufficient. The world has always contained pockets of relative richness. Human beings pass through them for tens of thousands of years without necessarily turning them into permanent settlements. A productive place can be visited repeatedly, loved even, without becoming a fixed centre. So another explanation presses in that abundance must combine with something else, something that turns a useful landscape into a socially binding one. That something may be ritual. The idea that symbolic or sacred investment helps anchor communities to place has grown increasingly important, especially with the excavation of sites that complicate the old order of events. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous example, though not the only suggestive one. Its monumental stone enclosures, built by pre-pottery Neolithic communities who are not yet living in full urban states or literate systems, force a reconsideration of what can pull human beings repeatedly to one place. If large-scale ritual activity, communal feasting, or ancestor-centered practices become attached to particular landscapes, then remaining may be driven by more than food security. People may stay or keep returning because the place has become spiritually charged, socially necessary, or cosmologically central. This possibility has an unusual power because it explains something abundance alone does not: why a community might continue holding to a place even when staying becomes difficult. A rich valley is useful, a burial ground, shrine, ceremonial center, or landscape saturated with ancestral meaning is something heavier. What survives in the record suggests that in several early settled societies, symbolic practices intensify alongside permanence: burials under floors, curated skulls, communal buildings, repeated architectural forms, structured deposits, and the unusual care given to certain spaces all hint that early settlement is not just an economic phenomenon. It is also a moral and spiritual one. The people do not merely occupy the place, they are shaped by its meaning. Then there is the explanation rooted in fear and insecurity, climate instability, shrinking reliable habitats, changes in prey movement, and pressure on local resources may have made the wider world harder to trust. Under such circumstances, remaining in one known location might feel safer than venturing into greater uncertainty. This interpretation gains strength in relation to episodes like the Younger Dryas. When climatic deterioration in parts of Southwest Asia may have made local abundance more fragile and distant alternatives less reliable. In this reading, settlement is not born only from opportunity, but from narrowing options. People stay because the horizon becomes less generous. There is real force in that argument as well. Human communities are pragmatic, and a known spring during a dry phase can be worth more than 100 remembered routes through failing country. Yet fear alone does not build walls, maintain houses, or inspire long-term collective labour unless staying also offers some compensating reward. A community purely trapped by conditions may endure for a while, but enduring is not the same as building a durable social world around permanence. Something more must support that persistence. One strong candidate is territoriality. Once groups begin investing more heavily in one location, storing food, burying ancestors, tending nearby plants, building structures, and relying on particular water sources, the logic of ownership, even if not formally articulated, begins to emerge. Valuable places become worth defending. Access becomes restricted. The settlement becomes not just where life happens, but where claim is enacted. In this interpretation, staying is driven partly by competition. People remain because the cost of losing a productive place to others is too high. The archaeological hints for this are suggestive, though never as simple as later borders or property law. Walls, enclosures, repeated rebuilding on the same footprint, clustering around key resources, and possible signs of violent injury at some sites all imply that access and exclusion may already matter. But territoriality has a chicken and egg problem. Do people stay because they become territorial, or become territorial because they stay? The answer is probably both. Claim and permanence reinforce one another. The first refusal to migrate may therefore involve not only attachment to place, but anxiety about losing place. Another explanation focuses on food production itself. In its classic form, this theory places agriculture at the center. Once people begin cultivating plants and eventually domesticating animals, they must remain near fields, herds, harvest cycles, and stored produce. Farming chains people to the land, and the village grows from that dependency. This remains an important part of the story, especially in later phases when cultivation intensifies and agriculture becomes the dominant basis of life. But as an explanation for the very beginning of staying, it has become less satisfying on its own. Too many early sites now show substantial residence before full agriculture clearly takes hold. That has led to a more nuanced version of the same idea. Perhaps the first communities settle because local wild resources allow it, and then cultivation emerges as a way to support greater population, reduce risk, or intensify yields within a world already becoming more fixed. In that model, settlement and food production are not cause and effect in a simple line. They form a feedback loop. People stay because some places are worth staying in. Then, because they stay, they begin managing plants and animals more intensively. And because they manage more intensively, staying becomes even harder to reverse. Demography also deserves attention. A growing population changes the arithmetic of movement. More people require more food, more coordination, more access to reliable resources, and perhaps more structured social arrangements. Some scholars argue that population increase, whether caused by local success or external concentration into favoured habitats, may have pushed communities toward greater sedentism, simply because old mobile patterns no longer scaled easily. A small band can move with relative flexibility. A larger, denser, more socially entangled population may find the same mobility cumbersome, risky, or socially disruptive. This has a certain grim plausibility. Success can become its own trap. A productive settlement supports more children. More children mean more future adults. More adults mean more demand on local systems and more investment in maintaining them. The community grows precisely because it has stayed, and then must continue staying because so many lives are now structured around that centre. What begins as opportunity becomes inertia. There is also prestige, which is easy to overlook because it leaves such indirect traces. A place that becomes known for abundance, ritual significance, craftsmanship, trade access, or ancestral depth may begin attracting people for reasons beyond survival alone. To remain in such a place may confer status. To host gatherings, control stored food, mediate ritual, or live in a settlement already heavy with memory may elevate certain households or individuals. In that case, settlement is not only practical but aspirational. People do not just endure rootedness. They may value it because it creates new forms of distinction. Scholars still debate how early such prestige dynamics become influential, and the evidence is often frustratingly indirect. But once one notices how quickly settlement creates visible differences in house form, access to goods, symbolic installations, or burial treatment, it becomes difficult to ignore the possibility that social standing helps hold communities in place. People stay not only because the land feeds them, but because the social world built there now offers roles, recognition, and power unavailable in a lighter mobile existence. What makes this debate so enduring is that each explanation works, but only partly. Abundance explains why some places attract repeated residents. Climate stress explains why the wider world may lose its appeal. Ritual explains why a place can become morally difficult to leave. Territoriality explains why access begins to matter. Cultivation explains how staying becomes materially reinforced. Demography explains why movement may become cumbersome. Prestige explains why permanence can become socially desirable. None of them alone is enough. Together, they begin to resemble real life. Real life is rarely governed by one cause. A spring draws people first. Good stands of grain keep them there longer. Burials make departure heavier. Ritual deepens attachment. Climatic stress narrows alternatives. Tending increases yields. Storage raises stakes. Boundaries appear. Population grows. Some individuals benefit more than others from controlling labour or access. Children grow up knowing the place is central. By the time anyone might ask why the group stays, the answer's no longer singular. It is embedded in every wall, floor, grave, and habit. That may be the most honest conclusion. The first time humans refuse to migrate is not driven by one clear revelation. It is a convergence. Several forces, each insufficient alone, combine in certain landscapes at certain moments and produce a new human condition. Settlement is not a pure invention, not a sudden trap, not a straightforward triumph. It is an entanglement of opportunity and pressure, of memory and necessity, of abundance and fear. And perhaps that is why the debate will never entirely end. The evidence remains incomplete. New excavations shift old assumptions. Botanical data changes timelines. Climate reconstructions grow more refined. Symbolic interpretation remains contested. Scholars argue, revise, and argue again. Yet beneath all those competing explanations, one fact endures with astonishing clarity. At some point, in more than one place, people who were fully capable of leaving decided, for reasons layered and complex, that they would remain. Everything that follows in human history grows from that difficult, uncertain, and still not fully explained choice. Once people begin remaining in one place long enough for houses, stores, graves, and shared routines to gather around them, time itself changes shape. That may be one of the least obvious but most consequential parts of the story. The first refusal to migrate does not simply alter where human beings live, it alters how they inhabit duration. In a mobile world, time is often measured through movement, the return of animals, the flowering of particular plants, the season when one leaves the low ground for higher shelter, the remembered distance between one camp and the next, the cycle of revisiting known places. In a settled world, time begins to accumulate vertically as well as seasonally. It gathers in the same patch of earth. That gathering transforms memory. A mobile people remembers landscapes as sequences. A settled people begins remembering them as layers. The difference is profound. When a group returns repeatedly to one favoured site, memory already has depth, of course. But when that site becomes a place of continuous or near-continuous occupation, yesterday does not simply precede today, it remains underneath it. A repaired hearth contains the ash of older fires. A rebuilt wall sits on the line of an earlier wall. A burial beneath the floor places the dead inside the daily life of the living. A child grows in a room where another child once slept, where an elder once died, where food was stored through a hard winter remembered by everyone old enough to understand it. Time no longer moves only across space, it settles into matter. This has enormous consequences for human consciousness, though one must be cautious because the inner life of prehistoric people cannot be excavated directly. Still, what survives in the record suggests a powerful shift. The more life becomes localized, the easier it becomes to compare present conditions with past ones in the same place. The water is lower than it was last year. The grain stand is thinner than when the grandmother was young. The house wall has cracked where an earlier wall once cracked. This part of the courtyard is where a burial took place. This post replaced another post after the flood. The land itself becomes an archive. To live in one place long enough is to dwell among evidence of change. That archive encourages foresight in new ways. Mobile societies certainly plan ahead. They must, and often with extraordinary sophistication. Routes, seasons, animal movements, weather patterns, and social obligations all demand long-range knowledge, but settled life changes the scale and texture of anticipation. The future begins to reside in things one can point to. A storage pit filled now for later hunger. A wall repaired in expectation of next season's rain. A patch of land cleared because it will matter months from now. A child raised not merely to travel routes, but to inherit specific structures, resources, and obligations tied to a location. Time becomes more materially invested. Inheritance grows from this shift like a shadow. A fully mobile world can certainly pass down knowledge, tools, identity, and ritual, but fixed property in the later sense remains limited when transport constrains accumulation. Settlement makes continuity heavier. Houses can be inherited, stored goods can be inherited, claims to nearby land, water, and burial ground can be inherited. Even if the formal legal structures of much later societies do not yet exist, the social logic begins here. The place now outlasts the individual in a way that invites succession. Who uses this space after the old woman dies? Who tends the hearth that belonged to one lineage? Who reopens the storage pit? Who sleeps above the buried ancestors? These are not abstract questions. They are the earliest human forms of historical continuity made domestic. Scholars still debate exactly how and when inheritance becomes formalized in early settled societies, because material traces can only take interpretation so far. But what survives in the record suggests that once people stay, the future becomes less open and more structured. Birth now places a person within a built environment, already carrying obligations and expectations. One does not simply join a moving band in the flow of a season. One enters a settlement with remembered rooms, familiar neighbours, long-standing routines, and perhaps nearby dead whose presence shapes the moral atmosphere of the home. Childhood itself changes under these conditions. A child raised in a more mobile society learns the world as a moving web of places and transitions. A child raised in an anchored settlement learns centrality. Home becomes not only where one sleeps tonight, but where one expects to begin and end most days. The same walls, the same threshold, the same work areas, the same water source, the same cluster of people, the same remembered stories attached to visible places. These things create a new kind of developmental environment. Continuity becomes ordinary before it becomes conscious. That is important because human beings often mistake inherited conditions for natural ones. What one generation negotiates painfully, the next may accept as the structure of reality. The first generations who remain may still feel the pull of the road, may still remember more flexible rhythms, may still treat permanence as fragile. Their children may not. Their grandchildren may not even understand why anyone would willingly abandon the place where their kin are buried, where food is stored, where memory is fixed in walls and floors. The refusal to migrate becomes strongest when it no longer feels like refusal at all. This new kind of human time also alters labour. Work in a mobile life is intense, skilled, and strategic, but much of it is directed toward immediate survival in changing contexts. Work in a settled life increasingly serves continuity. One labours to maintain what already exists and to prepare what will continue after the current task ends. The roof is mended not only for tonight, but for future seasons. Seed is stored not merely because food is needed now, but because next year has become a tangible concern tied to the same ground. The dead are buried not on a route that life will later pass beyond, but under the home that future days will continue to occupy. Labour becomes historical. It creates conditions intended to persist. With persistence comes a deepening sense of past and future as obligations rather than abstractions. Ancestors begin to matter differently when they remain close in the earth beneath the living. Descendants begin to matter differently when the house, the store, the managed land, or the ritual space can actually be handed on. This is where lineage gains a new type of physical anchor. In a mobile world, kinship is carried through people. In a settled world, Kinship begins attaching itself to place with greater force. The family is not only a network of living relations, it becomes a continuity rooted in structures and ground. There is revealing irony here. Settlement narrows physical movement, but it often expands temporal imagination. The more a community is tied to one location, the more it must think in seasons, generations, rebuildings, remembered failures, and planned recoveries. The settlement becomes a machine for producing long-term thinking, even if that thinking is not articulated in abstract philosophy. A house rebuilt on the same spot for the third or fourth time already contains a theory of continuity. A burial beneath the floor already contains a theory of relation between the living and the dead. A field or tended stand prepared for the next cycle already contains a theory of delayed return. These may not be written doctrines, but they are forms of temporal consciousness enacted in matter. No single explanation fully accounts for all the cultural consequences of this shift. Because different communities take different paths, some develop intense ancestor practices, some place greater emphasis on communal ritual, some organize inheritance more visibly than others, some maintain a strong memory of mobility even while settling, but the broad change remains unmistakable. Human beings begin living not only in the present and through the season, but within enduring local chronologies. The place itself begins telling them who came before and what must come after. This may also be the beginning of a new kind of anxiety. When the future becomes anchored in one place, failure becomes more than immediate loss. It becomes interruption. A bad harvest threatens not only hunger, but continuity. A damaged structure threatens not only shelter, but inherited order. A dispute threatens not only personal relationships, but the arrangement of a world meant to endure. The more settled life invests in the future, the more frightening rupture becomes. Mobility once offered a way to step out of local collapse. Permanence makes collapse intimate. Yet the same permanence also gives rise to meanings older lifeways could not preserve in the same way. Commemoration becomes spatial. Ritual deepens in recurring locations. Stories attach to rooms, walls, courtyards, springs, paths, and graves. A settlement can become a biography written collectively over generations. It can also become a burden, of course, weighted with obligation and constrained by everything that came before. But that burden is inseparable from a new human capacity, to live inside a place thick with remembered time. What survives in the archaeological record hints at this everywhere permanence takes hold. Layered floors, rebuilt foundations, successive burials, renewed plaster, storage reused over time, activity areas repeated with slight changes. The evidence remains incomplete, but it points in one direction. Settled people begin making futures that depend on returning to the same coordinates of daily life. They begin inhabiting history in the literal sense, because history now lies beneath their feet. That is why the first refusal to migrate changes more than geography. It changes the grammar of human existence. The past is no longer mostly behind, scattered along routes. It is here, under the house. The future is no longer mostly out there, somewhere beyond the next ridge. It is here too, in the seed, the wall, the child, the burial, the work done now for a season not yet arrived. Once human beings begin living this way, they do not just have homes, they have timelines rooted in earth. And from that rooted time, everything familiar about inheritance, belonging, responsibility, and historical identity begins to grow. The first refusal to migrate does not look, at the time, like the beginning of civilization. It looks smaller than that. It looks like a repaired wall, a deeper storage pit, a child growing up in the same house where an elder once slept, a burial placed beneath a floor so the dead remain inside the life of the living. It looks like people staying through one more difficult season, because too much already depends on the place they have made. But history is full of transformations that arrive disguised as ordinary endurance. This is one of the largest of them, because once a community remains long enough, and often enough, and densely enough, the settlement stops being a strategy and becomes a trap that can also produce wonders. This is the contradiction at the heart of settled life. To stay is to gain stability, memory, continuity, and the capacity to build. It is also to surrender some of the freedom that once protected human beings from local failure. The same rootedness that allows houses to grow into villages, villages into towns, and towns into cities also creates dependence, hierarchy, surveillance, territorial conflict, and new forms of misery. The trap is not a mistake. It is a system of trade-offs that becomes self-reinforcing. Once enough people are inside it, there is no simple return to the older, lighter world. Population is one of the first forces to tighten the mechanism. Settled communities can support more children, especially when food storage becomes reliable enough to reduce some forms of immediate risk. More children mean more adults later, and more adults mean more labour, but also more demand. Houses multiply, food needs intensify, nearby resources are used more heavily. This settlement becomes too large, too invested, too socially dense to move easily. What might once have been a flexible group can no longer lift itself and relocate without enormous loss. Size makes permanence harder to reverse. With size comes coordination, and with coordination comes authority. Not necessarily kings at first, not palaces, not written decrees carved into stone, but the beginnings of people who organize labor, mediate disputes, control access, interpret ritual, allocate space, or speak with greater weight because the community has become too complex for pure improvisation. A mobile band can often rely on diffuse influence, temporary leadership, and the practical ability of dissatisfied people to leave. A fixed settlement makes leaving harder and central management more attractive. Someone must decide who repairs what, who stores what, who uses which space, who settles boundary tensions, who watches over shared resources. This is where inequality begins finding stable ground. Scholars still debate how early substantial hierarchy appears in different settled communities, and the evidence remains uneven. Some early villages appear relatively egalitarian in certain material respects. Others show signs that differences in house size, burial treatment, access to goods, symbolic display, or control of labor are already becoming meaningful. No single explanation fully accounts for why inequality hardens faster in some places than others. Ecology matters. Trade matters. Ritual authority matters. Kinship matters. But the general pattern is difficult to avoid. Once food can be stored, space can be inherited, and labor can be organized around fixed property and fixed ritual centers, some people will control more than others. That control does not always begin through violence. Often it begins through usefulness. The person who manages the store, the lineage associated with the best water access, the household that becomes central in ritual life, the family whose labor organizes rebuilding after flood or fire, the individuals best able to negotiate conflict with neighboring groups. Power in early settled societies may emerge through competence, charisma, ancestry, sacred association, or proximity to key resources. Yet once it emerges in a fixed landscape, it can persist in ways mobility once made harder. A house can remain central across generations. A favoured burial area can legitimize claim. Stored wealth can survive from one season to the next. A boundary can be defended not just with force, but with memory. The village, in other words, becomes a machine that can preserve differences. At the same time, settled life makes possible achievements that mobility rarely encourages on the same scale. Architecture becomes more ambitious because it does not need to be carried. Craft specialization becomes more viable because some people can focus more narrowly when supported by stored surplus or dense exchange. Ritual grows more elaborate when sacred spaces remain fixed and communal memory accumulates in the same structures. Knowledge becomes local in productive ways about soils. Seasons, plant cycles, construction techniques, storage strategies, water management, and the social handling of density itself. The trap generates competence. It also generates splendor. From these rooted communities grow the conditions for everything later associated with civilization-enduring villages, large ceremonial centers, irrigation systems, craft quarters, property law, taxation, written record-keeping, class divisions, kingdoms, imperial capitals. None of these are present in full at the first refusal to migrate, but their preconditions are: once people stay, they can accumulate. Once they accumulate, they can compare. Once they compare, they can compete. Once they compete, they can dominate or submit. Once they dominate, they need systems to remember obligations, stores, boundaries, debt, and lineage. The path is not linear, and many settled societies never become states. Still, the broad arc is unmistakable. Civilization grows not from movement, but from entrapment in place. There is a bitter irony in that growth. Many of the things later celebrated as the achievements of civilization monuments, administration, metallurgy on larger scales, urban planning, organized religion, literature, political power depend on systems that also deepen human inequality, increase the scale of violence, and make ordinary people more vulnerable to extraction by elites. The first settlement does not create tyranny by itself, but it makes tyranny possible. A mobile people can often escape a bad leader. A settled population with fields, walls, storehouses, and ancestors in the ground has fewer exits. This may be why the language of trap is so useful, even if it must be handled carefully. It does not mean that early settled people are foolish or duped. They are adapting intelligently to real opportunities and real pressures. But the resulting system begins to produce consequences larger than the original decision. A family stays because the spring is good. The grain stands are nearby. The burial ground is here, and the horizon feels uncertain. Their grandchildren inherit heavier tools. Thicker walls, deeper routines, stronger boundaries, and more obligations. Their distant descendants inherit class, taxation, armies, and cities. The trap closes slowly enough that no one generation has to choose all of it. That is how it succeeds. What survives in the archaeological record sometimes reveals the early edges of this process with haunting clarity. Dense settlement layers, house clusters that imply inherited space, special buildings set apart from ordinary dwellings, uneven access to exotic goods brought through exchange, burials with differing treatment, walls that require coordinated labour, storage facilities whose scale hints at collective management or centralised control. None of these on their own prove the full later apparatus of civilization, but together they show the pressure building. Settled life is no longer just about survival, it is about structure. And structure changes the imagination. Once a people lives inside permanent or semi-permanent arrangements, they begin imagining continuity at larger scales, not just household continuity, but settlement continuity, not just survival through the next season, but the maintenance of an enduring community. That is the emotional precondition for public works, for shared ritual calendars, for communal memory tied to architecture, for organized labor that exceeds immediate household need. It is also the precondition for someone claiming the right to direct such labor. The same mental shift that allows a people to build a wall against floodwater can, in another age, allow rulers to command terraces, temples, canals, or fortifications through the work of thousands. The village is therefore both cradle and warning. It gives human beings new powers by limiting older freedoms. It makes art denser, memory deeper, ritual more stable, and material life more complex. It also makes labor easier to appropriate, populations easier to locate, and social roles easier to harden into inherited ranks. Civilization, in this sense, is not simply born from cooperation. It is born from cooperation that becomes difficult to refuse. A lesser-known but important point is that the trap does not spring everywhere in the same way. Some settled societies remain relatively decentralized for very long periods. Some cultivate without building large states. Some create dense ritual worlds without obvious kingship. Others move quickly toward hierarchy and institutional control, geography, ecology, trade, warfare, demography, and belief all shape the path differently. No single explanation fully accounts for why one village becomes a city-state, while another remains a long-lived farming community. But in all cases, the precondition remains the same. People must first remain long enough for place to outweigh movement. That is what makes this early turning point so enormous. A species that survives by mobility discovers that mobility can be surrendered in exchange for continuity, and continuity can be expanded into complexity. The cost is dependence, the reward is civilization, the cost is also civilization. By now the road still exists, but it is no longer the framework of existence. It has been demoted. Trade routes, hunting paths, visiting circuits, pilgrimage trails, and journeys for marriage or exchange still matter, but they all radiate from settlements that increasingly command loyalty and labor. Human beings are no longer primarily the creatures of the root. They are becoming the creatures of the built center. And once that happens, the trap cannot easily be opened. Too many children are born inside it. Too many dead lie beneath it. Too much grain waits in its storage pits. Too much power depends on its continuity. The first people who refuse to migrate do not know they are laying the floor of cities, palaces, temples, and states. They only know that staying has become necessary, meaningful, and difficult to undo. But that is enough. From that necessity, the whole heavy architecture of civilization begins to rise. The story begins with a people who stop following the horizon, but it ends in a world built almost entirely from the consequences of that pause. Once the first communities remain long enough for staying to become inheritance rather than experiment, the old human balance is permanently altered. Movement does not disappear. People still trade, raid, marry across distance, hunt far from home, carry goods along coasts and rivers, cross mountains, flee drought, and scatter from war. But movement is no longer the basic condition of life for everyone. More and more, it becomes a departure from a center, and that center is now called home. That word carries an extraordinary burden. Before settlement, home is often a network of relationships, a pattern of return, a body of knowledge carried through people and route. After settlement, home becomes increasingly architectural. It has walls, thresholds, roofs, storage spaces, burial places, remembered corners, inherited claims. It can be damaged, defended, enlarged, lost, rebuilt, and passed down. It can also exclude. This is one of the deepest legacies of that first refusal to migrate. Human beings begin to build belonging into matter. Once that happens, belonging can be intensified, but it can also be denied. Borders grow from this logic like larger versions of the first walls. A line around a settlement becomes in time a line around a field system, then a district, then a kingdom, then a state. The emotional principle remains strangely familiar. This is where we remain. This is what we defend. This is where our dead are. This is where labour has accumulated. This is where memory resides. Modern nations often speak in grand political language, but under that language lies something very old. The settled instinct to treat place not merely as ground, but as identity made visible. The first refusal to migrate echoes there, inside every map. So does the tension between mobility and rootedness, even in the modern world, where roads, ships, trains, and aircraft make long-distance movement easier than at any earlier point in history. Human beings remain divided by the same ancient contradiction. Some are drawn to movement, opportunity, reinvention, the widening horizon. Others are drawn to continuity, inheritance, local belonging, and the moral gravity of staying put. Most people carry both impulses at once. That is why migration is never only economic or practical. It touches something deeper. To leave can feel like liberation or like severance. To remain can feel like safety or like entrapment. The emotional structure is ancient because the decision itself is ancient. What survives in the present suggests that the first settled turning point never truly ended. It was not a one-time transition completed in prehistory. It became a permanent argument inside human life. Cities still depend on concentrated labour, fixed infrastructure, stored resources, and the expectation that people will remain long enough to keep systems working. Farms still bind families to inherited land. Homes still concentrate memory. Property still encodes the old logic of defended space. Cemeteries still gather the dead to the places where the living claim continuity. Governments still count, tax, regulate, and protect populations that can be located because they are settled. Schools, roads, markets, borders, real estate, mortgages, citizenship. Even the ordinary phrase, going back home, all of it rests on the old human decision to make staying normal. There is a darker echo as well. Because settlement made civilization possible, it also made displacement traumatic in a way it had not always been before. When a mobile group moves, movement is part of life, even if hardship accompanies it. When a settled population is forced to move, it experiences not just relocation, but rupture. Houses are lost, graves are left behind, fields are abandoned, streets, courtyards, shrines, storage places, and inherited rooms vanish into memory. The pain of exile, so central to later history, depends on a settled world. One cannot be exiled from a camp in quite the same way. Exile is the wound left by permanence. Scholars still debate exactly where to place the first full threshold of sedentism in different regions, and the evidence remains incomplete. New excavations continue to complicate old narratives. Some societies once thought fully mobile now appear more anchored in certain seasons. Some settlements once interpreted simply as farming villages turn out to have deeper roots in pre-agricultural abundance or ritual concentration. No single explanation fully accounts for the global story. Yet the legacy is unmistakable. Once human beings in several parts of the world begin refusing to migrate as a default response to change, they generate a future from which there is no broad retreat. Even later pastoralists, traders, empires, and migrant societies move through a world increasingly organized by settled centers. A lesser-known truth is that the old mobile inheritance never fully dies. It survives inside seasonal labor, nomadic and semi-nomadic peoples, merchant routes, pilgrimage traditions, maritime cultures, refugee movements, exploration, diaspora, and the persistent restlessness of individuals who feel confined by rooted life. The road never disappears. It becomes secondary, then symbolic, then romanticized, then feared, then rediscovered. But it remains, always as memory or temptation. That may be why settled societies tell so many stories about wandering heroes, lost homelands, promised lands, border crossings, departures, and returns. This species remembers both halves of itself, and perhaps that is the strangest part of the whole story. Human beings did not simply choose settlement over movement and leave the old life behind. They split themselves. One part stayed with the hearth, the burial, the field, the wall, the stored grain, the future rooted in one place. The other part kept looking outward, toward weather, distance, danger, and possibility. Civilization is built by the first instinct, but repeatedly unsettled, renewed, enriched, and threatened by the second. The tension between them is still visible everywhere. The first time humans refuse to migrate, then, is not merely a prehistoric curiosity. It is the opening scene of the modern condition. It explains why place matters so much, why loss of place hurts so deeply, why borders become sacred, why inheritance becomes powerful, why property becomes emotionally charged, why displacement can destroy more than shelter, why home is never just a structure, and why leaving is never just movement. It also explains why so much of human greatness and so much of human suffering grow from the same source, the decision to remain long enough for the ground beneath us to become part of who we are. In the end, the earliest people who stayed probably did not imagine any of this. They did not foresee nations, mortgages, city walls, cadastral surveys, refugee columns, or apartment keys. They knew only that this place still held water, that the grain nearby could be gathered, that the house could be repaired, that the dead were here, that the road beyond the ridge no longer seemed more trustworthy than the ground below their feet. That was enough. A choice made at the scale of one valley. One spring, one cluster of houses, one season too many becomes the framework of later history. The horizon still exists as it always did, but now, for most of humanity, it is something seen from a doorway. The first places humans refuse to leave are gone now, or rather, they remain in the strangest possible way. Their walls have fallen, their roofs have dissolved into dust, their hearths are cold, and the people who once moved through them with such ordinary certainty have vanished so completely that even their names are lost. But the shape of their decision is still here. It survives in buried floors, in layers of ash, in seeds blackened by forgotten fire, in the quiet outline of rooms where someone once chose to stay through one more season and then another, until staying became life itself. There is something almost fragile about that beginning. No banners, no kings, no founding myth announced to the sky. Just a place that proved itself enough times to become harder to leave than to endure. A spring that kept flowing, a patch of grain that returned, a house repaired instead of abandoned, a grave placed close to the living, the future arriving not as revelation, but as repetition. That may be why this turning point feels so haunting. It is enormous in consequence, but intimate in form. Civilization does not begin with triumph. It begins with attachment. And attachment always carries a shadow. The same act that creates home also creates loss. The same rootedness that gives memory a place to gather also makes rupture more painful. Once people bind themselves to land, to walls, to burials, to stores, to inherited thresholds, the world changes its weight. A person can still leave, but leaving is no longer only motion. It becomes separation. The road is no longer the whole story. It becomes what waits beyond the edge of what one cannot easily abandon. That is why the earlier settled places still feel close, even across 10,000 years or more. Not because their lives are the same as ours. They are not. Their tools, fears, diets, seasons, and beliefs belong to worlds far older and harsher than most modern people will ever know. But the emotional structure is familiar. The wish for continuity, the fear of losing what has been built, the strange comfort of waking in the same place, the way memory settles into corners, paths, walls, and ground. These things remain recognizably human. So in the end, the story is not only about when people stopped moving, it is about when the earth beneath them began to hold more than footprints. It began to hold obligation, ancestry, labour, hope, and identity. A piece of ground became more than a resource. It became a centre. And from that centre, history spread outward in widening circles. Somewhere in the deep past, evening falls over one of those first settlements. The work is done for now. Smoke rises thinly into cooling air. Water darkens near the edge of the known ground. Inside a shelter patched many times before. A child sleeps above older bones, beneath a roof repaired for another season not yet seen. Beyond the last houses, the horizon is still open, still waiting, still immense, but no one follows it tonight.